Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of Britain's most fascinating and contradictory monarchs, George IV, the glamorous king who nearly bankrupted his nation while creating some of its most beautiful landmarks. We'll softly explore his extravagant youth filled with gambling and secret romances, his architectural dreams that gave us the magnificent Brighton pavilion, and his scandalous marriage that became the talk of Europe. From his days as the rebellious Prince Regent fighting Napoleon, to his reluctant approval of Catholic emancipation, we'll discover how this king of style over substance helped shape the modern British monarchy. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Even if you're feeling a bit shy, just tell me which part of George's story intrigues you most. Was it his secret marriage, his architectural wonders, or perhaps his dramatic feuds? Your gentle thoughts mean the world to our Sleepy Crown family. And if you're enjoying this journey through royal history, a quiet like and subscribe would help us create more of these soothing historical tales for you. So cozy up under your favorite blanket, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from Georgian England lull you into the most restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to our peaceful corner of YouTube, where history becomes your lullaby. George, later known as King George IV, entered the world on a warm August morning in 1762, his first cries echoing through the grand corridors of St. James's Palace. Born into the House of Hanover as the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, this infant prince was destined for a throne he would both glorify and scandalize in equal measure. From his earliest moments, young George was surrounded by the finest luxuries the Georgian court could provide. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across nursery walls adorned with the richest tapestries, while armies of servants attended to his every need. Yet beneath this gilded exterior lay the seeds of rebellion that would define his extraordinary life. His father, King George III, was a man of simple tastes and rigid moral principles, qualities that seemed to skip entirely over his eldest son. Where the king preferred modest entertainments and early bedtimes, young George would grow to crave spectacular parties and late-night revelries. Where his father valued thrift and careful spending, George would develop an almost supernatural ability to accumulate debt. Queen Charlotte, that formidable German princess who had brought stability to the British court, watched her firstborn with a mixture of pride and growing concern. Even as a child, George possessed an undeniable charm. Those twinkling eyes could melt the sternest governess, and his quick wit delighted courtiers who had grown accustomed to his father's more serious demeanor. The young prince's education followed the traditional royal pattern of tutors, languages, and endless lessons in statecraft. Yet something in George's spirit rebelled against the careful structure his parents had created. While his younger brothers dutifully absorbed their lessons, George's attention wandered to the world beyond the palace walls, a world of colour, music, fashion, and freedom that called to him like a siren's song. As he grew from a cherubic child into a handsome teenager, it became increasingly clear that this prince would chart his own course through life, regardless of royal protocol or his father's disapproval. The stage was set for one of the most fascinating reigns in British history, a reign that would be marked by equal measures of magnificent achievement and spectacular scandal. When George reached his 21st birthday in August 1783, the transformation from dutiful prince to rebellious young man was complete. King George III, perhaps hoping to channel his son's energies more constructively, granted him his own establishment and an income that would have supported several noble families in comfort. The prince received $60,000 per year from Parliament, equivalent to millions in today's currency. along with an additional $50,000 from his father's privy purse. To house his newfound independence, George was given Carlton House on Pall Mall, a magnificent Georgian mansion that would become the epicenter of London's most fashionable society. The moment he took possession of those elegant rooms, the young prince began planning transformations that would make Carlton House the most talked-about residence in Europe. George immediately commissioned the celebrated architect Henry Holland to completely redesign his new home. No expense was considered too great, no luxury too extravagant for the prince's vision. Holland created rooms that seemed to float in clouds of silk and gold, with Chinese wallpapers that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and furniture crafted by the finest artisans money could buy. The prince's stables alone consumed $31,000 per year, more than half his official income. These were not merely practical buildings to house horses, but architectural marvels where the prince's thoroughbreds lived in greater luxury than most English families. Each stall was fitted with brass fixtures, mahogany panels, and the finest Italian marble, because George believed that true refinement extended to every aspect of life, including the accommodation of one's horses. Within months of establishing his independence, the prince had assembled around himself a glittering court of the most fashionable, witty, and often disreputable characters in London society. Carlton House became a magnet for artists, writers, politicians, and adventurers. Anyone with charm, intelligence, or simply an amusing story to tell could find a welcome at the prince's table. The entertainments George hosted were legendary throughout Europe. His dinners featured exotic delicacies imported at enormous cost from across the globe: turtle soup from the Caribbean, champagne from the finest French vineyards, and elaborate confections created by French chefs who commanded salaries that rivaled those of government ministers. The prince's parties often began at sunset and continued until dawn, with guests dancing, gaming, and feasting in rooms illuminated by thousands of candles in crystal chandeliers. But it was not merely the luxury that set Carlton House apart. It was George himself. The prince possessed a natural magnetism that drew people into his orbit. He was a brilliant conversationalist who could discuss art with painters, politics with statesmen, and poetry with authors, switching effortlessly between English, French, Italian, and German as the mood required. His laughter was infectious, his wit sharp but rarely cruel, and his genuine interest in others made even the most jaded courtiers feel they had found a true friend. Yet beneath this charming exterior lay a dangerous impulsiveness that would shape the prince's entire life. When George wanted something, whether it was a particular painting, a beautiful woman, or simply the thrill of a high-stakes card game, he pursued it with an intensity that brooked no consideration of cost or consequence. This trait, so appealing in a friend and patron, would prove catastrophic in a future king. Among the glittering society that swirled around Carlton House, none held more influence over the young prince than the fascinating circle known as the Devonshire House Set, led by the charismatic Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, and her political ally Charles James Fox. This group represented everything that King George III found most threatening about his son's new independence. Charles James Fox was perhaps the most brilliant orator of his generation, a man whose speeches in Parliament could move audiences to tears or rouse them to thunderous applause. He was also a notorious gambler, whose losses at the card tables were legendary throughout London. Fox had once lost $140,000 in a single evening, a sum so vast that it represented the annual income of several great estates. Yet the next morning, he would appear in Parliament, seemingly untroubled, ready to debate the great issues of the day with his customary eloquence. It was this very combination of genius and recklessness that fascinated young Prince George. In Fox, he saw a man who lived by his own rules, who refused to be bound by the conventional wisdom that governed lesser mortals. When Fox spoke of American independence with passionate conviction, even though it opposed the king's policy, George found himself nodding in agreement. When Fox criticized the government's handling of various crises, the prince discovered that he too harbored doubts about the wisdom of his father's ministers. The political implications of this friendship horrified King George III. Fox was not merely a member of the opposition. He was the leader of the Whig Party, the faction that had consistently challenged royal authority and pushed for greater parliamentary power. For the heir to the throne to be seen dining, drinking, and gambling with such a man represented a constitutional crisis of the first order. Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, added another layer of complexity to this dangerous friendship. Beautiful, intelligent, and utterly fearless in her pursuit of pleasure, she had transformed Devonshire House into a rival court that often seemed more brilliant than the official royal residence. Georgiana hosted salons where the greatest minds of the age gathered to discuss everything from poetry to politics, and her influence over fashionable society was so complete that a single word from her could make or break a reputation. The Duchess was also a passionate gambler, whose losses rivaled those of Fox himself. She and the prince would spend entire nights at the card tables, their excitement building as the stakes climbed ever higher. These gaming sessions became legendary for their extravagance. Fortunes that had taken generations to accumulate would disappear in a single evening, only for the players to return the next night, ready to risk everything once again. But it was not merely the gambling that bound this circle together. It was a shared philosophy that life should be lived with passion, style, and complete disregard for conventional morality. They believed in the pursuit of pleasure as an art form, in the cultivation of wit as a virtue, and in the importance of living each day as if it might be their last. For a young prince who had spent his childhood bound by rigid protocol and stern disapproval, this philosophy was intoxicating. The political discussions that took place in these glittering drawing rooms were equally seductive. Fox and his friends spoke eloquently of liberty, justice, and the rights of man, ideas that seemed to offer a nobler purpose for George's life than the ceremonial duties that awaited him as king. When Fox supported the American colonists in their struggle for independence, George found himself sympathizing with their cause, even though it opposed everything his father represented. This political awakening was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of George's association with the Devonshire House Set. King George III had spent his entire reign defending royal prerogatives against parliamentary encroachment, and the idea that his own heir might sympathize with his political opponents filled him with despair. Father and son began to have increasingly bitter arguments about politics, with George defending Fox's positions with all the passionate intensity of youth. By the summer of 1784, less than a year after gaining his independence, Prince George had already accumulated debts of $29,000, a staggering sum that represented several times his official annual income. The prince's creditors included everyone from fashionable tailors on Bond Street to the finest cabinet makers in London, from French chefs to Italian singing masters, from horse dealers to jewelers, whose bills alone could have funded a small war. King George III's reaction to his son's extravagance was a mixture of fury and despair. The king had always prided himself on his careful management of royal finances, and the idea that his heir could squander such vast sums on frivolous luxuries offended every principle he held dear. In a series of increasingly angry letters, the king demanded explanations for specific expenditures, questioned the necessity of various purchases, and threatened to cut off his son's allowance entirely if the spending did not cease immediately. But George seemed incapable of understanding his father's concerns. To the prince, beauty was not a luxury, but a necessity. Elegance, not an indulgence, but a duty. How could he be expected to live in rooms decorated with anything less than perfection? How could he serve meals that were not prepared by the finest chefs available? How could he appear in public wearing clothes that were not created by the most skilled tailors in Europe? These were not questions of vanity in George's mind, but matters of royal dignity. The situation was complicated by the prince's genuine generosity. George was incapable of saying no to a friend in need, and his acquaintances quickly learned that an amusing story or a flattering compliment could often result in a substantial loan that would never be repaid. Artists found themselves commissioned to create works at prices that bore no relationship to market value, while musicians and writers discovered that the prince's patronage came with financial rewards that far exceeded the value of their services. Parliament, faced with the embarrassing spectacle of the heir to the throne being pursued by creditors, reluctantly agreed to provide relief. In 1787, after months of negotiations, they voted to pay $161,000 to settle the prince's debts, a sum so vast that it provoked outrage throughout the country. The common people, struggling with their own economic difficulties, could not understand how one man could spend so much money in such a short time. The parliamentary bailout came with conditions that George found humiliating. He was required to provide detailed accounts of his expenditures, to accept oversight of his household management, and to promise greater restraint in future spending. These restrictions chafed against every instinct the prince possessed, and he quickly found ways to circumvent them while maintaining the appearance of compliance. More troubling still was the growing realization that his father's disapproval extended beyond mere financial concerns. King George III had begun to see his son's lifestyle as a threat to the very foundations of the monarchy. The king believed that royal authority depended on moral example, that the crown's legitimacy rested on the personal virtue of its wearer. George's association with gamblers, his friendship with political radicals, and his obvious pursuit of pleasure for its own sake undermined everything the king was trying to achieve. The relationship between father and son deteriorated to the point where they could barely tolerate each other's company. State occasions became ordeals of barely concealed hostility, with courtiers choosing sides and the press gleefully reporting every sign of family discord. When George appeared at court, wearing the blue and buff colours of the Whig Party, a deliberate provocation that announced his political sympathies to everyone present, the king's fury was so intense that observers feared he might suffer one of the fits of madness that were already beginning to trouble him. Yet, despite his father's anger and Parliament's restrictions, George seemed unable to change his ways. The prince had discovered a world of beauty, pleasure, and intellectual stimulation that made the rigid formality of his upbringing seem unbearably dull by comparison. He had tasted freedom, and no amount of royal disapproval could make him willingly return to the gilded cage of conventional monarchy. The stage was set for even greater extravagances, more scandalous liaisons, and a secret marriage that would shake the foundations of the British Constitution itself. In the winter of 1784, at a fashionable evening party in the glittering salons of London society, Prince George's eyes fell upon a woman who would alter the course of his life forever. Maria Fitzherbert was 28 years old, 6 years the prince's senior, and possessed of a beauty that was both striking and serene. Her dark hair was elegantly arranged in the fashion of the day. Her complexion had the porcelain perfection that was the hallmark of well-bred English roses, and her eyes held a depth of character that suggested both intelligence and strength of will. But Maria was not merely another society beauty seeking royal attention. She was a widow twice over, having buried 2 husbands before reaching her 30th year, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had known both love and loss. Her first husband, Edward Weld, had died within months of their wedding, leaving her with little more than memories and a modest inheritance. Her second marriage, to Thomas Fitzherbert, had lasted longer and provided her with financial security. But when he too died, Maria found herself once again alone in the world. What made Maria truly remarkable, however, was not her beauty or her tragic history, but her unwavering Catholic faith. In an England where Catholics faced legal disabilities and social prejudice, where they could not hold public office or sit in Parliament, Maria Fitzherbert practiced her religion with quiet courage. She attended Mass regularly, supported Catholic charities, and moved in a circle of recusant families who had maintained their faith despite centuries of persecution. When Prince George was introduced to Mrs. Fitzherbert at that winter evening gathering, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. Here was a woman unlike any he had ever encountered, sophisticated yet modest, beautiful yet untouchable, warm in her conversation, yet maintaining a distance that only made her more intriguing. Where the ladies of his usual circle threw themselves at his feet with embarrassing eagerness, Maria treated him with the same polite courtesy she might show any gentleman of quality. The prince began to pursue her with all the passionate intensity that characterized everything he did. Flowers arrived at her modest house on Park Street every morning, each bouquet more elaborate than the last. Invitations to the finest entertainments in London followed, along with gifts of jewellery, books, and exotic delicacies that spoke of the sender's refined taste and unlimited resources. But Maria remained politely distant, accepting his attentions with gracious thanks, while never encouraging them to develop into something more intimate. This resistance only inflamed George's passion further. He was accustomed to getting everything he wanted immediately, whether it was a particular work of art, a fine horse, or the company of a beautiful woman. The idea that Maria might not be impressed by his rank, his wealth, or his considerable charm was both incomprehensible and utterly fascinating to him. He began to haunt the places where she might appear, engineering seemingly casual encounters that allowed him to display his wit and intelligence in the hope of winning her regard. Maria, for her part, was not immune to the prince's appeal. He was undeniably handsome, with those famous Hanoverian good looks that had made his family the envy of European courts. More importantly, he was genuinely intelligent and well-educated, able to converse knowledgeably about art, literature, music, and politics. When he chose to be charming, George could make any woman feel as though she were the most fascinating creature he had ever encountered. But Maria was also realistic about the impossibility of any serious relationship between them. She was a Catholic widow with no great fortune and no significant family connections. He was the heir to the throne of a Protestant nation, destined to marry a princess chosen for political advantage rather than personal inclination. The very idea of anything developing between them was not merely impractical, but dangerous for both of them. As the months passed, however, George's pursuit became increasingly desperate. He wrote her passionate letters declaring his undying love, staged dramatic scenes in public places where he proclaimed his devotion before astonished audiences, and even threatened to leave the country if she continued to reject his advances. His friends watched with growing concern as the normally confident prince transformed into something resembling a lovesick schoolboy. The crisis came in the summer of 1785, when George, driven beyond reason by Maria's continued resistance, staged what appeared to be a suicide attempt. Whether genuine or theatrical, the gesture had its intended effect. Maria, horrified by the thought that she might be responsible for the prince's death, finally agreed to see him privately and hear what he had to say. In the elegant drawing room of Maria Fitzherbert's house on Park Street, Prince George made the proposal that would change both their lives forever. Kneeling before her with tears streaming down his face, he begged her to become his wife, not his mistress, not his secret paramour, but his legally wedded wife in the eyes of God and the Catholic Church. Maria's initial response was one of horror. She understood better than the lovesick prince the legal impossibilities that made such a marriage not merely inadvisable, but potentially treasonous. The Act of Settlement of 1701 explicitly forbade any member of the royal family from marrying a Catholic without forfeiting their right to the throne. The Royal Marriage Act of 1772 required the king's consent for any marriage involving a royal prince under the age of 25, consent that King George III would never, under any circumstances, provide for a union with a Catholic widow. But George was beyond such practical considerations. He declared that he cared nothing for the throne if he could not share it with Maria, that he would rather live as a private gentleman with the woman he loved than reign as a lonely king over subjects who meant nothing to him. His passion was so overwhelming, his declarations so fervent, that Maria found her own resolve beginning to weaken despite her better judgment. The negotiations that followed were conducted in the utmost secrecy, with only Maria's closest confidants aware of what was being contemplated. Her uncle, Henry Errington, and her brother, John Smythe, served as intermediaries, helping to work out the practical details of what would be, legally speaking, no marriage at all. They consulted with Catholic theologians who assured them that a ceremony performed according to the rites of the Church would be valid in the eyes of God, regardless of what English law might say about the matter. The greatest challenge was finding a clergyman willing to perform the ceremony. The bride and groom would be committing no crime under English law. Since the marriage would not be legally recognized, there could be no charge of violating the Royal Marriage Act, but any Anglican priest who participated would be risking his career and possibly his freedom for conducting what amounted to a mockery of the established church. The solution came in the person of the Reverend Robert Burt, one of the prince's chaplains in ordinary, who found himself imprisoned in the Fleet prison for debts of $500. When George offered to pay these debts in exchange for performing a marriage ceremony, Bert's scruples proved less powerful than his desire for freedom. The bargain was struck, and arrangements were made for the most secret royal wedding in English history. On the evening of December 15, 1785, as London society prepared for another night of parties and entertainments, a very different kind of gathering took place in Maria Fitzherbert's drawing room. The bride wore a simple gown of ivory silk, with no jewels save for a strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother. The groom was dressed in a plain brown coat, having deliberately chosen attire that would attract no attention should he be seen entering or leaving the house. The ceremony itself was brief and solemn, conducted according to the rites of the Church of England, with Henry Errington and John Smythe serving as witnesses. The Reverend Burt spoke the ancient words that had joined countless couples in matrimony, and George Augustus Frederick, Prince of Wales, took Maria Anne Fitzherbert to be his wedded wife. They exchanged rings, made their vows before God, and became husband and wife in everything but the eyes of English law. The wedding was followed by a simple wedding breakfast, with champagne and cake served in Maria's modest dining room. There was no fanfare, no celebration beyond the quiet joy of two people who had chosen love over duty, passion over prudence, when the last guest had departed and the servants had cleared away the evidence of the evening's events. George and Maria were left alone together as husband and wife. In the months that followed, they lived as openly as they dared, maintaining separate households, but spending most of their time together. George moved his residence to Brighton, where the social atmosphere was more relaxed and the prying eyes of court officials less intrusive. Maria established herself in a charming house on the Stein, and together they created a little court of their own, surrounded by friends who were willing to pretend that their union was perfectly legal and proper. Their happiness during this period was complete and genuine. George had found in Maria not merely a beautiful wife, but an intelligent companion who could match his wit, share his interests, and provide the emotional stability that had been lacking in his turbulent life. Maria, for her part, discovered that beneath the prince's reputation for frivolity lay a man of genuine depth and sensitivity, someone capable of great kindness and unexpected wisdom. But their secret could not remain hidden forever, and the political implications of the prince's marriage were too significant to be ignored indefinitely. The rumours began almost immediately, whispered in the drawing rooms of fashionable London, and debated in the coffee houses where political gossip was the primary entertainment. Had the Prince of Wales really married Mrs. Fitzherbert? Was the heir to the throne secretly wed to a Catholic? What would this mean for the succession, for the Protestant nature of the British crown, for the delicate balance of power between monarchy and Parliament? King George III, when the whispers reached his ears, initially refused to believe them. Surely his son, however reckless and extravagant, would not be so foolish as to contract a marriage that would effectively bar him from the throne. But as the rumours persisted and grew more detailed, the king's concern turned to alarm. He ordered discreet inquiries to be made, and while no definitive proof could be obtained, the evidence was increasingly suggestive. The political crisis deepened when Parliament reconvened in 1787 to consider the prince's request for yet another bailout to cover his mounting debts. The prince owed over $269,000, a sum so staggering that it required careful justification to a Parliament already weary of royal extravagance. But how could the members vote additional funds to support the prince's household if that household might include a Catholic wife whose very existence threatened the Protestant succession? Charles James Fox, the prince's closest political ally, found himself in an impossible position. As leader of the Whig opposition, Fox had built his career on defending civil liberties and religious tolerance. In principle, he supported the right of any man to marry according to his conscience, regardless of religious differences, but he also recognized that a Catholic queen would provoke a constitutional crisis that could bring down the government and possibly the monarchy itself. The matter came to a head during a heated debate in the House of Commons, when a member of Parliament directly challenged Fox to confirm or deny the marriage rumours. Fox, speaking on what he believed to be the prince's authority, rose to address the chamber with one of the most significant speeches of his career. "I am authorised to say," Fox declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed chamber, "that the story is a malicious falsehood, utterly devoid of foundation." The words rang out with all the authority of Fox's renowned oratory, and for a moment it seemed as though the crisis had been averted. The members of Parliament, relieved to hear an authoritative denial, voted to approve the prince's financial relief with relatively little additional controversy. But Fox's categorical denial created new problems that would haunt both men for years to come. Maria Fitzherbert, who had been following the parliamentary debates with growing anxiety, was devastated to hear her marriage described as a malicious falsehood. In her mind, she was truly and legally married to the prince in the eyes of God and the Catholic Church, regardless of what English law might say. To have that sacred bond publicly dismissed as a lie was more painful than any financial hardship or social ostracism could have been. The prince himself was caught between his political necessity and his personal honour. He had authorised Fox to make the denial, because he recognized that any admission of the marriage would have catastrophic consequences for his position as heir to the throne. But he also knew that Maria had every right to feel betrayed by his public rejection of their union. The woman he claimed to love above all others had been sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. Maria initially considered ending their relationship entirely, and for several weeks she refused to see the prince or receive his letters. Her friends counseled her to break with him completely, to protect what remained of her reputation by distancing herself from a man who had publicly denied their sacred bond. But George's distress was so genuine, his remorse so complete, that she eventually agreed to a reconciliation. The compromise they reached was typical of their complex relationship. They would continue to live as husband and wife in private, while accepting that their union could never be publicly acknowledged. Maria would have to endure seeing herself described in the press as the prince's mistress rather than his wife, while George would have to bear the knowledge that he had publicly dishonored the woman he claimed to love. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely, allowing both of them to maintain their personal happiness while preserving the political stability of the realm. But George's financial situation was becoming increasingly desperate, and Parliament was growing less willing to bail him out without significant reforms to his lifestyle. The solution, when it came, would require an even greater sacrifice than the public denial of his marriage. It would require him to take another wife entirely. By the early 1790s, Prince George's financial situation had deteriorated beyond mere embarrassment into genuine crisis. Despite Parliament's previous bailouts, despite the substantial income he received from his father and the Duchy of Cornwall, despite various economies supposedly implemented in his household, the prince's debts had swollen to the unprecedented sum of 650,000, equivalent to tens of millions in modern currency. This was not merely a personal problem, but a constitutional crisis waiting to explode. The prince's creditors included everyone from London's most prestigious banks to foreign suppliers who had extended credit based on his royal status. If he defaulted on these obligations, the scandal would undermine confidence in the British monarchy throughout Europe. Foreign courts, many of them connected to the Hanoverian dynasty through marriage and alliance, watched nervously as rumours of the prince's financial difficulties spread through diplomatic channels. The sources of this astronomical debt were as varied as they were extravagant. Carlton House continued to consume vast sums as George commissioned new decorations, imported exotic furnishings, and maintained a household that rivaled Versailles in its magnificence. His stables alone cost more than most noble families spent on their entire establishments, while his wine cellar contained vintages that represented the work of generations of French vintners. But perhaps most troubling were the gambling losses that mounted with each passing season. The prince's evening at the card tables of Brooks's Club or Devonshire House could result in losses of $10,000 or more, sums that would have supported middle-class families for decades. These debts were matters of honour in Georgian society. A gentleman who failed to pay his gaming debts faced social ostracism and permanent disgrace. King George III, confronted with yet another request for financial assistance from his wayward son, finally reached the limits of his patience and his purse. The king's own finances were carefully managed and relatively modest by royal standards, reflecting his personal preference for simplicity and his genuine concern for the burden placed on taxpayers. The idea of asking Parliament for another massive grant to cover George's excesses filled him with shame and fury in equal measure. Parliament, for its part, was becoming increasingly reluctant to continue funding what appeared to be unlimited extravagance. The members of the House of Commons, many of whom represented constituencies struggling with economic difficulties, found it increasingly difficult to justify voting vast sums to maintain the prince's luxurious lifestyle. public opinion, as reflected in newspapers and pamphlets, was growing hostile to what seemed like an endless series of royal bailouts. The political opposition, led by George's supposed friend Charles James Fox, found themselves in an awkward position. While they sympathized with the prince's political views and enjoyed his patronage, they could hardly defend his financial irresponsibility without appearing hypocritical. Fox himself was notorious for his own gambling losses, but even he recognized that there were limits to what the public would tolerate. The government ministers who served King George III were even more direct in their criticism. They pointed out that the prince's debts were accumulating faster than any conceivable income could service them, that his spending showed no signs of moderating despite repeated promises of reform, and that the monarchy's reputation was suffering with each new revelation of extravagance. It was in this climate of crisis that a solution began to emerge, a solution that would require George to make the greatest sacrifice of his personal happiness in exchange for financial salvation. The precedent was clear. Parliament would pay a prince's debts, but only in exchange for a suitable marriage that would secure the succession and demonstrate his commitment to fulfilling his royal duties. The prince's unmarried status had long been a source of concern to constitutional experts and foreign diplomats. At 32 years old, George had no legitimate heirs, and his secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, even if it were legally valid, had produced no children. If something happened to him, the succession would pass to his younger brothers, potentially creating a crisis of legitimacy that could destabilize the realm. The search for a suitable bride for the Prince of Wales was conducted with all the diplomatic precision of a military campaign, but with results that would prove far more catastrophic than any military defeat. King George III, his ministers, and various European courts compiled lists of eligible Protestant princesses, evaluating each candidate's political connections, financial circumstances, and potential fertility with the cold calculation of horse breeders selecting stock. Among the names that emerged from these deliberations was that of Princess Caroline Amelia Elizabeth of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, daughter of Duke Charles William Ferdinand, and Princess Augusta of Great Britain, making her both a suitable Protestant and the prince's own first cousin. On paper, Caroline appeared to meet all the necessary criteria. She was of appropriate rank, her Protestant faith was unquestioned, and her family connections would strengthen ties between Britain and the German states. But the reality of Princess Caroline was far more complicated than the diplomatic correspondence suggested. At 26, she had remained unmarried despite numerous proposals, and those who knew her well understood why. Caroline possessed a robust, earthy personality that had little patience for the refined sensibilities of court life. She spoke her mind with a directness that shocked even German society, where plain speaking was more tolerated than in the elaborate ceremonies of other European courts. More troubling still were the reports about Caroline's personal habits, which filtered back through diplomatic channels in carefully coded language that nevertheless conveyed serious concerns. Her approach to personal hygiene was, by the standards of the day, remarkably casual. In an era when frequent bathing was considered both fashionable and healthy among the upper classes, Caroline seemed indifferent to such refinements. Her clothing, while expensive, was often stained or carelessly arranged, and her hair was frequently unkempt despite the ministrations of skilled ladies' maids. These details might have been overlooked in a princess destined for a minor German court, but they represented serious problems for a future Queen of England. The British court, influenced by the refined sensibilities of Queen Charlotte and the increasingly sophisticated tastes of London society, expected its royal ladies to embody the highest standards of elegance and refinement. Caroline's casual approach to these matters suggested that she would struggle to fulfill the ceremonial aspects of her role. Yet the political necessities that drove the marriage negotiations left little room for personal preferences or concerns about compatibility. King George III, desperate to resolve his son's financial crisis and secure the succession, viewed Caroline as an acceptable solution to multiple problems. She was Protestant, royal, and available, qualities that outweighed any minor concerns about her personality or habits. The prince himself played little role in the selection process, apparently resigned to accepting whatever bride his father and ministers deemed suitable. His heart remained with Maria Fitzherbert, and the prospect of marriage to anyone else filled him with distaste. When shown Caroline's portrait, he expressed neither enthusiasm nor objection, perhaps hoping that political necessity might at least produce a bride he could tolerate if not love. The formal negotiations proceeded according to established diplomatic protocol, with representatives of both courts working out the detailed terms of the marriage settlement. Caroline would receive a substantial income as Princess of Wales, along with her own household and the precedence due to her rank. In exchange, she would be expected to provide heirs to the throne and to conduct herself with the dignity appropriate to her position. When news of the engagement was announced in early 1795, the public reaction was generally favourable. The British people, weary of the prince's extravagances and scandals, hoped that marriage would encourage him to adopt a more settled lifestyle. The newspapers, while maintaining their satirical edge, expressed cautious optimism that a German princess of respectable lineage might bring some stability to the wayward heir's life. Even the prince's creditors expressed relief, knowing that Parliament would likely approve a generous settlement once the marriage was formalised. But the reality of the match would prove far more disastrous than anyone could have imagined. Lord Malmesbury, the experienced diplomat tasked with escorting Caroline to England, began to have serious misgivings during the journey. He observed her behaviour with growing alarm, noting her tendency to make inappropriate comments, her complete disregard for the subtle protocols that governed royal life, and what he delicately described as her indelicate manners. Malmesbury attempted to prepare Caroline for her new life, offering gentle guidance on the expectations of the British court. He suggested that she might wish to bathe more frequently, that she should perhaps take greater care with her appearance, and that she might benefit from exercising more restraint in her conversation. Caroline listened to his advice with what appeared to be polite attention, but her subsequent behaviour suggested that she had absorbed very little of it. The fateful meeting between Prince George and Princess Caroline took place on April 5th, 1795, at St. James's Palace. The prince had arranged the introduction with some care, hoping that the reality might prove more palatable than his expectations. He was attended by Lord Malmesbury and several other courtiers, while Caroline was accompanied by her German ladies and various officials who had made the journey from Brunswick. As Caroline entered the reception room, George's face betrayed his true feelings with a transparency that horrified the watching courtiers. His expression shifted from polite expectation to barely concealed revulsion in the space of a heartbeat. Caroline, though not classically beautiful, was not unattractive, but there was something about her physical presence that seemed to repel the fastidious prince at a visceral level. The prince approached his bride-to-be, performed the necessary courtesies with mechanical precision, and then turned abruptly to Lord Malmesbury. "Harris," he said, in a voice that carried clearly across the silent room, "I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." The request was so inappropriate, so obviously an escape from the woman before him, that even the experienced diplomat was momentarily at a loss for words. Caroline, for her part, seemed oblivious to the prince's distress. She chattered away in a mixture of English and German, making observations about the palace, the weather, and various other topics with a cheerfulness that suggested either remarkable insensitivity or deliberate defiance. When the prince excused himself and fled the room, she turned to her attendants and remarked loudly that the prince was nothing like his portraits, which had led her to expect someone far more attractive. Over the following days, as preparations for the wedding continued, George attempted to drown his misery in alcohol with a dedication that alarmed even his hard-drinking friends. He wrote desperate letters to Maria Fitzherbert, begging her to save him from this fate, promising that his heart would always belong to her regardless of whatever legal ceremonies he might be forced to endure. Maria, dignified in her pain, did not respond to these pleas. The prince also discovered additional aspects of Caroline's personality that deepened his horror. She possessed a crude sense of humor that delighted in shocking her listeners with inappropriate jokes and observations. Her table manners, while not technically incorrect, lacked the refined grace expected at court. Most troublingly, there seemed to be a perverse pleasure she took in deliberately offending the sensibilities of those around her, as if she were testing the limits of what her royal status would allow her to get away with. The wedding ceremony itself, held on April 8, 1795, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, was a mockery of everything a royal wedding should represent. The prince arrived so intoxicated that he could barely stand upright, requiring the support of several attendants to make his way to the altar. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements unsteady, and his attempts to recite his vows were slurred and barely comprehensible. Caroline, seemingly unperturbed by her groom's condition, stood beside him in a gown of silver tissue trimmed with ermine, one of the few aspects of the day that met the standards expected of a royal wedding. She repeated her vows clearly and, with apparent satisfaction, perhaps genuinely believing that her marriage to the heir of the British throne represented a triumph despite the obvious disaster unfolding around her. The Archbishop of Canterbury, conducting the ceremony, maintained his composure with remarkable professionalism, though those close enough could see the concern in his eyes as he watched the prince sway dangerously during the service. King George III, attending with Queen Charlotte, kept his gaze fixed firmly on the altar, his expression carefully neutral, but his hands gripping the arms of his chair with white-knuckled intensity. The wedding breakfast that followed was an equally uncomfortable affair, with the prince continuing to consume alarming quantities of alcohol while Caroline held court among the German delegation, apparently delighted with her new status as Princess of Wales. The British courtiers who attended exchanged meaningful glances and carefully neutral pleasantries, each silently calculating the disaster this marriage represented for the stability of the monarchy. When the newly married couple finally retired to their chambers that evening, the disaster reached its terrible culmination. According to Caroline's later testimony, which she would share with remarkable candor to anyone who would listen, George was so drunk that he collapsed into the bedroom fireplace and remained there until morning, having passed out completely. The princess, whether from shock, resignation, or her own peculiar sense of humor, apparently left him there and went to bed alone. Despite this inauspicious beginning, Princess Charlotte was conceived during those first dreadful days of the marriage, evidence that some form of marital relations did take place, however distasteful both parties might have found the experience. This fact would later become significant in determining the line of succession, though at the time it represented merely another complication in an already catastrophic situation. Within weeks of the wedding, the prince and princess had established separate households and were communicating primarily through intermediaries. George made no secret of his feelings, telling anyone who would listen that he found his wife repulsive and that he considered their marriage a form of torture imposed upon him by financial necessity. Caroline, equally candid, expressed her disappointment with a husband who was nothing like the romantic prince she had imagined. The breakdown of the royal marriage became the primary entertainment of London society, satirical prints appeared with astonishing speed, depicting the prince as a corpulent drunkard and Caroline as either a victim or a harridan, depending on the political sympathies of the artist. The newspapers, always eager for scandal, reported every rumour and speculation about the state of affairs between the Prince and Princess of Wales. King George III, mortified by this public spectacle, attempted to mediate between his son and daughter-in-law, but his efforts only seemed to make matters worse. The prince refused to discuss the matter with his father, while Caroline seemed to delight in shocking the king with detailed accounts of her husband's behaviour. The Queen, maintaining her legendary composure, attempted to befriend Caroline and guide her in the ways of the British court, but the princess proved resistant to guidance. The situation deteriorated further with the birth of Princess Charlotte. In January 1796, the prince attended the birth, fulfilling his duty to witness the arrival of a potential heir. But as soon as he confirmed that both mother and child had survived, he wrote his will. In this extraordinary document, he bequeathed all his worldly property to Maria Fitzherbert, my wife, the wife of my heart and soul, a public declaration of where his true affections lay, regardless of legal niceties. Having secured the succession with a legitimate heir, George saw no reason to continue even the pretense of a marriage. Within months of Charlotte's birth, he formally separated from Caroline, establishing her in a separate residence with her own household and income, but making it clear that they would have no further personal contact. The princess, perhaps relieved to escape her husband's presence, established herself at Blackheath and began creating her own independent court. It was at Blackheath that Caroline's behaviour became increasingly erratic and scandalous. Free from the constraints of direct royal supervision, she surrounded herself with a bizarre collection of friends, hangers-on, and admirers, whose presence raised eyebrows throughout polite society. She adopted orphan children with little regard for proper procedures, leading to rumours that some of these children might actually be her own illegitimate offspring. The most persistent rumour concerned a young boy named William Austin, whom Caroline claimed to have adopted, but whom gossips insisted was her biological son. The whispers grew so loud that in 1806, King George III was forced to order an official investigation. The Delicate Investigation, as it came to be known. A committee of distinguished statesmen interviewed witnesses, examined evidence, and ultimately concluded that while Caroline's behaviour had been indiscreet and inappropriate, there was no proof that William Austin was her child. But the investigation, rather than clearing Caroline's name, seemed to confirm the worst fears about her judgment and character. Witnesses testified to her inappropriate conversations, her tendency to make crude jokes about sexual matters, and her apparent lack of understanding about proper royal behaviour. The testimony painted a picture of a woman who was either deliberately provocative or genuinely unable to comprehend the standards expected of a future queen. George, reading the transcripts of the investigation with a mixture of vindication and horror, saw his worst fears confirmed. He had been forced to marry a woman who was not merely personally disagreeable, but potentially unfit to represent the monarchy. Yet divorce remained impossible under English law unless one party could prove adultery, and despite all her indiscretions, Caroline had been careful enough, or fortunate enough, to avoid providing definitive proof of an affair. The situation might have continued indefinitely in this state of mutual hostility and separate lives, with Caroline maintaining her eccentric court at Blackheath, while George pursued his own interests in London and Brighton. But as the years passed and King George III's mental health deteriorated, the possibility loomed that George might soon become king, which would make Caroline his queen, regardless of their personal feelings or the scandals that surrounded her. In 1814, Caroline made the decision that would ultimately lead to the greatest scandal of George's reign. Tired of the restrictions and supervision that limited her activities in England, she decided to leave the country and establish herself on the continent. George was delighted by this development, hoping that distance might make the problem of his wife simply fade away. He even offered to increase her income substantially if she would agree to remain abroad permanently. Caroline accepted the increased income, but made no firm promises about her future plans. She established herself first in Italy, where she quickly became a fixture of Roman and Neapolitan society. Her behavior, freed from even the minimal constraints of English supervision, became increasingly outrageous. She dressed in costumes that scandalized even the relatively relaxed standards of Italian society, attended public balls in transparent gowns, and made no secret of her friendship with a handsome Italian courier named Bartolomeo Pergami. Pergami had entered Caroline's service as a simple courier, but quickly rose to become the effective head of her household. He was tall, dark, and handsome in the romantic Italian style, with a magnificently curled moustache and an easy charm that seemed to appeal to Caroline's earthy sensibilities. Whether their relationship was actually adulterous or merely inappropriately familiar became the subject of intense speculation and would eventually form the basis of the greatest scandal of the age. The prince, receiving reports of Caroline's Italian adventures through a network of spies and informants, saw an opportunity. If he could prove that his wife had committed adultery, he would finally have grounds for divorce under English law. He commissioned a secret investigation, the Milan Commission, to gather evidence of Caroline's relationship with Pergami, sending agents to interview servants, collect testimony, and document every indiscretion. The reports that came back were sensational. Witnesses testified that Caroline and Pergami traveled together unchaperoned, that they shared accommodations in ways that suggested intimacy, and that Caroline's behavior toward him showed a familiarity that went far beyond what was appropriate between an employer and servant. There were accounts of Caroline bathing on deck while Pergami attended her, of the two dining alone together, and of sleeping arrangements that strongly suggested a sexual relationship. Yet despite the accumulation of suggestive evidence, there was no definitive proof of adultery. No witness could testify to actually seeing Caroline and Pergami in bed together, and the circumstantial evidence, however damning, might not be sufficient to secure a divorce in the face of Caroline's denials. The prince found himself in the frustrating position of being morally certain of his wife's infidelity, but unable to prove it conclusively. The situation remained unresolved as George entered his 5th decade of life, still married to a woman he detested, still longing for Maria Fitzherbert, whom he had publicly denied, and still accumulating debts despite the marriage that was supposed to have resolved his financial difficulties. The stage was being set for an even greater crisis, one that would explode onto the public stage when his father finally died, and George became king at last, long before the marriage disaster with Caroline, before the financial crises that would define his later years. Prince George had discovered a place where he could escape the judgmental eyes of London society and the disapproving glare of his father. Brighton, a small fishing village on the Sussex coast, had been transformed in the late 18th century into a fashionable seaside resort where the wealthy and titled came to take the medicinal sea waters and enjoy the relaxed social atmosphere. George first visited Brighton in 1783 at the age of 21, on the advice of physicians who suggested that sea bathing might help relieve the symptoms of gout that were already beginning to trouble him. The prince arrived expecting little more than a brief respite from his symptoms, but he found something far more valuable, a place where he could be himself, away from the rigid protocols of court life and the constant scrutiny of his father's officials. The town itself was undergoing a transformation. Dr. Richard Russell's influential treatise on the health benefits of seawater had made Brighton fashionable among the upper classes, and enterprising developers were beginning to replace the modest fishermen's cottages with elegant townhouses and assembly rooms. The air smelled of salt and seaweed. The light had a particular quality that artists found inspiring, and the social atmosphere was decidedly more relaxed than the stiff formality of London's drawing rooms. Within months of his first visit, George had decided to establish a permanent residence in Brighton. He instructed his cook, Louis Welcher, to acquire a suitable property, and Welcher found a respectable farmhouse on the Steyne, the wide promenade that served as Brighton's social centre. The house was modest by royal standards, a simple Georgian structure that had previously served as a superior lodging house for visiting gentlefolk, but it had good bones and sat in a prime location overlooking the sea. George immediately commissioned Henry Holland, the architect who was already transforming Carlton House, to convert this modest building into something more suitable for royal residence. Holland's initial design, completed in 1787, created what became known as the Marine Pavilion, a graceful neoclassical structure with a central rotunda crowned by a shallow dome. The exterior was finished in cream-coloured stucco that gleamed in the Brighton sunlight, while the interior featured elegant proportions and fashionable decorations that reflected the restrained good taste of Georgian architecture. But even as Holland's Marine Pavilion was being completed, George's imagination was already racing ahead to something grander, something that would reflect not merely wealth and refinement, but genuine originality of vision. The prince had become fascinated with Oriental art and architecture, collecting Chinese porcelain and Japanese lacquer work with the enthusiasm of a true connoisseur. He dreamed of creating something unique in England, a palace that would transport visitors to the exotic East while remaining firmly planted on the Sussex coast. The transformation of the Marine Pavilion into the extraordinary structure we know today began in earnest in 1815, when George commissioned John Nash, his favourite architect, to undertake a complete reimagining of the building. Nash, who had already designed the spectacular Regent Street development in London, approached the Brighton project with the same combination of boldness and technical innovation that characterized all his best work. Nash's design drew inspiration from a variety of sources, creating what can only be described as a fantasia on Oriental themes. The exterior, with its onion domes, minarets, and latticework screens, evoked the Mughal architecture of India, while the interior incorporated Chinese, Japanese, and even elements of Turkish design. The technical challenge was enormous: how to superimpose these elaborate decorative elements onto Holland's existing structure without compromising its structural integrity. The solution was brilliantly innovative. Nash designed a cast-iron framework that could be placed over the existing building, supporting the new domes and minarets without requiring massive alterations to the foundations. This use of industrial materials for decorative purposes was revolutionary, anticipating by decades the great iron and glass structures of the Victorian era. The framework was then covered with specially designed tiles and ornamental details that created the illusion of solid masonry construction while keeping the weight manageable. The largest dome, crowning the central pavilion, rose to a height of 70 feet and was inspired by the Taj Mahal's famous silhouette. Indeed, as though Nash had never visited India and worked primarily from engravings and paintings. Surrounding this central dome were a cluster of smaller domes and tent-like roofs, each crowned with elaborate finials and decorative elements that caught the light and seemed to dance against the sky. The minarets, those slender towers that punctuated the roof line, were not mere decorations, but served practical purposes as well. Some housed ventilation systems for the rooms below, while others concealed chimneys that carried smoke from the numerous fireplaces required to heat the vast interior spaces. Nash understood that true architectural brilliance lay not merely in appearance, but in the successful marriage of form and function. The exterior was painted in warm cream tones that complemented the natural light of the seaside setting, with details picked out in white and gold that sparkled in the sun. The overall effect was unlike anything England had ever seen. A building that seemed to have materialized from some romantic oriental tale, yet was firmly rooted in the landscape of Sussex. The partnership between Prince George and John Nash represented one of the most fruitful collaborations in architectural history, producing buildings that would define an entire era and establish a new aesthetic vocabulary for royal architecture. Nash, born in 1752, had experienced both spectacular success and crushing failure in his career before catching the prince's attention, and he brought to their partnership a combination of daring imagination and hard-won practical wisdom. Nash had begun his architectural career in London, but had gone bankrupt in the 1780s, forcing him to retreat to Wales, where he rebuilt his reputation through a series of country house commissions. His partnership with the landscape gardener Humphrey Repton had taught him to think about architecture not merely as isolated buildings, but as elements within larger designed landscapes, a perspective that would prove crucial in his later work with the prince. When George appointed Nash to redesign the Brighton Pavilion, he gave the architect an almost unlimited creative brief. The prince wanted something spectacular, something that would astonish visitors and establish Brighton as a centre of architectural innovation. More importantly, he wanted something that expressed his own sophisticated understanding of beauty, a building that would demonstrate that monarchy could be both powerful and culturally refined. Nash responded with designs that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible with available materials and construction methods. The elaborate cast-iron framework that supported the domes and minarets required precision engineering that was at the cutting edge of industrial technology. The decorative elements, the lattice screens, the carved brackets, the ornamental finials, had to be designed so they could be manufactured to exact specifications and assembled on site with minimal adjustment. But technical innovation was only part of Nash's achievement. The architect understood that the pavilion needed to work not merely as a spectacular exterior, but as a functional royal residence. The interior layout had to accommodate both grand state occasions and intimate private gatherings, with seamless transitions between public and private spaces. Servants needed to be able to move through the building efficiently without disrupting the activities of royal residents and guests. The exterior design incorporated elements from multiple Oriental traditions, creating what scholars now call the Indo-Saracenic style, a deliberate blending of Indian, Islamic, and Chinese architectural motifs. The onion domes were inspired by Mughal architecture, particularly the celebrated Taj Mahal, while the latticed screens echoed Islamic geometric patterns. Yet Nash also incorporated distinctly European elements, including classical proportions and Gothic decorative details, creating a synthesis that was entirely original. The building's silhouette was carefully calculated to create maximum dramatic impact. Nash arranged the domes and minarets so they would be visible from multiple vantage points throughout Brighton, ensuring that the pavilion dominated the townscape without overwhelming it. The central dome was deliberately positioned to be framed by the approaching streets, drawing visitors' eyes upward to appreciate its scale and complexity. The use of colour was equally sophisticated. Nash understood that the warm cream tones of the exterior would appear different depending on the quality of light, glowing golden in the morning sun, taking on cooler tones in the afternoon, and seeming to float ethereally in the soft light of evening. The white and gold details were positioned to catch the light at different times of day, ensuring that the building never appeared static, but seemed to change its mood with the shifting hours. Perhaps most remarkably, Nash achieved all this while working with George's notoriously changeable temperament and ever-evolving vision. The prince would visit the construction site regularly, suggesting modifications, requesting additional details, or completely changing his mind about elements that had already been approved. Nash, with remarkable patience and diplomatic skill, managed to accommodate these royal whims while maintaining the overall coherence of his design. The construction process itself was a marvel of coordination. Nash employed hundreds of workers, stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, painters, glaziers, and specialized craftsmen, whose skills were required for the elaborate decorative elements. Many of these workers had to learn new techniques specifically for the pavilion project, as the unusual design required methods that had not been used in English construction before. The cost, predictably, was astronomical. The initial estimates of $150,000 quickly proved laughably inadequate, as the scope of the project expanded, and the prince's demands for ever greater magnificence drove the specifications beyond anything originally planned. By the time the exterior was completed in 1822, the total expenditure had exceeded $500,000, equivalent to tens of millions in modern currency, and this did not include the costs of the elaborate interior decorations that were still being completed. If the exterior of the Brighton pavilion represented Nash's genius for architectural drama, the interior was where the true extravagance of George's vision reached its full expression. The prince assembled a team of the finest decorative artists and craftsmen in Europe, led by Frederick Crace and Robert Jones, to create interiors that would transport visitors into what George imagined as the exotic splendor of the Orient. The entrance hall set the tone for what was to follow, a relatively modest space by the standards of the rest of the building, but one that immediately announced that visitors had left the familiar world of Georgian England behind. The walls were painted in soft pink tones that complemented the natural light filtering through stained glass windows, while elaborate plasterwork picked out in gold created patterns inspired by Chinese lattice screens. But it was the great state rooms that truly revealed the extent of the decorative scheme. The music room, designed by Frederick Crace, represented perhaps the single most elaborate interior space created during the Regency period. The walls were covered in hand-painted Chinese wallpaper, depicting scenes of gardens, pavilions, and graceful figures engaged in various activities. This wallpaper alone cost thousands of pounds and required artists to work for months creating the elaborate scenes. The ceiling of the music room was painted to resemble a canopy of leaves and blossoms, with a massive chandelier suspended from a center point that gave the illusion of opening to the sky above. The chandelier itself was a masterpiece of decorative art, 9 feet in diameter and weighing over a ton. It featured gilt dragons and elaborate glass drops that caught the candlelight and scattered it throughout the room in prismatic patterns. The walls were further embellished with elaborate plasterwork incorporating Chinese motifs, dragons, phoenixes, bamboo, and flowering branches, all picked out in gold leaf that gleamed in the light. Decorative panels featured painted scenes in the Chinese style, though created by English artists who had never visited China and worked primarily from imported porcelain and lacquer work. The result was not authentic Chinese art, but rather a European fantasy of what such art might look like, what art historians now call chinoiserie. The furniture in the music room was equally spectacular. Pieces were specially commissioned from the finest cabinet makers, designed to harmonize with the decorative scheme while providing comfortable seating for the prince and his guests. Chairs and sofas were upholstered in rich silks imported from China and Japan, while tables and cabinets featured elaborate inlay work incorporating mother-of-pearl, rare woods, and precious metals. The banqueting room, decorated by Robert Jones, took a different approach, but was no less spectacular. Here, the theme was explicitly Indian rather than Chinese, with painted decorations that evoked the palace interiors of Mughal emperors. The dome above was painted to resemble a tropical sky, with a massive plantain tree at its center, from which descended an enormous chandelier held in the claws of a silver dragon. This chandelier, even larger than the one in the music room, weighed nearly a ton and cost over $5,600, roughly equivalent to £500,000 today. It featured 6 smaller dragons supporting lotus-shaped bowls that held additional lights, creating a complex hierarchy of illumination that could transform the room's atmosphere depending on how many candles were lit. The overall effect was meant to evoke the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, filtered through a Georgian imagination that had never actually seen such wonders. The walls of the banqueting room were decorated with hand-painted panels depicting Chinese landscapes and pavilions, but Jones added distinctly Indian elements, including painted elephants, tigers, and exotic birds. The mixture of Oriental motifs from different cultures would have horrified purists, but George was not interested in archaeological accuracy. He wanted to create an atmosphere of exotic luxury that would dazzle his guests and demonstrate his sophisticated understanding of beauty. The long gallery, which connected the major staterooms, was treated as an elaborate indoor garden. The walls were covered with hand-painted wallpaper featuring bamboo groves, flowering trees, and Chinese figures in traditional dress. Hexagonal lanterns hung from the ceiling, their silk shades painted with additional Chinese motifs. The overall effect was of walking through a covered pathway in some imaginary Oriental garden, with each step revealing new decorative details to admire. Even the private apartments were elaborately decorated, though here the scale was somewhat more intimate. George's own bedroom featured a bed canopy designed to resemble a Chinese pavilion, with elaborate draperies in the richest silks. The walls were covered in hand-painted silk panels featuring birds, flowers, and butterflies rendered in the Chinese style. A specially designed writing desk incorporated lacquered panels and mother-of-pearl inlay, while the carpet was woven to a custom design that harmonized with the overall decorative scheme. The attention to detail extended to every aspect of the interior. Door handles were specially designed to complement the decorative themes of each room. Light fixtures were crafted to appear as though they belonged in Oriental palaces rather than English country houses. Even the servants' areas, though less elaborately decorated, incorporated design elements that maintained the overall aesthetic unity of the building. The kitchens deserved special mention, as they represented some of the most advanced domestic technology of the era. George, who took a genuine interest in fine cuisine, insisted that his chefs have access to the best possible facilities. The great kitchen featured an elaborate system of ovens, stoves, and roasting spits, with a revolutionary steam-powered mechanism for turning the spits automatically. The walls were lined with copper pots and utensils, all kept polished to a mirror shine, and the workspace was designed to accommodate the large team of chefs and assistants required to produce the elaborate meals the prince demanded. The total cost of the interior decorations exceeded even the astronomical sum spent on the architectural work. Estimates vary, but it appears that over $200,000 was spent on furnishings, decorations, and the countless elaborate details that made the pavilion such an extraordinary achievement. This was at a time when the average working-class family might live on $50 per year, making the expenditure on royal luxury seem almost incomprehensible to ordinary citizens. Public reaction to the pavilion was mixed, to say the least. Visitors who were admitted to tour the state rooms were invariably impressed by the sheer spectacle of the decorations, even if they privately questioned the taste that had produced such elaborate Oriental fantasies. But many critics, both at the time and later, saw the pavilion as the perfect symbol of George's character. Magnificent, but excessive. Cultured, but self-indulgent. Beautiful, but ultimately frivolous. The satirists and caricaturists had a field day with the pavilion. Prints appeared showing the building as a grotesque wedding cake, or a bizarre confection more suitable for a pantomime than a royal residence. The costs were endlessly mocked, with commentators calculating how many poor families could have been fed or housed for the price of a single chandelier. The building's Oriental character was portrayed as evidence of the prince's un-English sensibilities, his preference for foreign luxury over honest British plainness. Yet despite the criticism, the pavilion represented a genuine achievement in architectural and decorative art. It demonstrated that English craftsmen and artists could match or exceed the finest work being produced anywhere in Europe. It showed that industrial materials like cast iron could be used for purposes beyond mere utility, creating beauty as well as strength. And it established Brighton as a centre of fashionable society, transforming a modest seaside town into a resort that would remain popular for generations to come. More importantly, perhaps, the pavilion gave George a place where he could truly be himself. Here, surrounded by beauty of his own creating, attended by friends who shared his sophisticated tastes, the prince could forget for a while the disappointments of his marriage, the weight of his debts, and the disapproval of his father. The pavilion became both his escape and his monument, a physical manifestation of his belief that life should be lived with style, grace, and an appreciation for beauty in all its forms. The autumn of 1810 brought with it a crisis that had been building for decades, one that would fundamentally alter the nature of British monarchy and thrust Prince George into a role he had long anticipated, but perhaps never truly prepared for. King George III, who had suffered periodic bouts of mental illness throughout his reign, experienced a relapse so severe and so obviously permanent that even his most loyal supporters could no longer pretend he was capable of ruling. The immediate trigger for this final breakdown was the death of Princess Amelia, the king's youngest and most beloved daughter. At 27, Amelia had succumbed to tuberculosis after a long and painful illness, and her death shattered what remained of her father's fragile mental stability. The king, who had always doted on his daughters with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with his stern treatment of his sons, was utterly devastated by the loss. Within days of Amelia's death, the king's behaviour became increasingly erratic. He would ramble for hours without pause, his conversations jumping from topic to topic with no apparent logic. He saw visions and heard voices, conducting animated discussions with people who were not present, some long dead, others purely imaginary. His attendants reported that he would sometimes speak so rapidly that his words became incomprehensible, a torrent of sound that conveyed agitation, but no actual meaning. The physicians who attended the king tried every treatment known to Georgian medicine. They bled him repeatedly, applied leeches, administered powerful emetics and purgatives, and subjected him to the infamous restraint chair when his agitation became violent. These treatments, far from helping, seemed only to increase his suffering. The once dignified monarch who had ruled for 50 years was reduced to a pathetic figure, physically restrained and mentally absent, occasionally emerging into brief periods of lucidity, only to descend again into confusion. Queen Charlotte, who had stood by her husband through previous episodes of illness, watched this final decline with heartbreak. She recognized that this time there would be no recovery. no return to the devoted husband and conscientious ruler she had known. The king she had married was gone, replaced by this tragic figure who sometimes didn't recognize his own wife and who lived in a world of delusions and hallucinations. The political implications of the king's condition were profound and constitutionally complex. Britain had no provision for a regent beyond the precedent set during the king's previous illnesses, and Parliament had to act quickly to establish a legal framework that would allow government to continue functioning. The Regency Act of 1811 was carefully crafted to balance the need for effective leadership with concerns about granting too much power to a prince whose judgment and character were widely questioned. The Act imposed initial restrictions on the Prince Regent's authority, limiting his ability to grant peerages, make certain appointments, or dispose of royal property. These restrictions would automatically expire after 1 year if the king's condition had not improved, a provision that reflected both hope for recovery and realistic assessment of the situation. The Act also made careful provisions for the king's care, ensuring that he would be treated with dignity, even as effective power passed to his son. For Prince George, the moment he had long anticipated arrived with a mixture of emotions more complex than simple triumph. He was 50 years old, no longer the dashing young rebel, but a corpulent middle-aged man whose health was already declining and whose reputation had been thoroughly tarnished by decades of scandal. The power he now held came not through his father's voluntary surrender, but through the king's tragic incapacity, a circumstance that complicated any satisfaction he might have felt. The prince's first act as regent was to visit his father, a meeting that observers described as deeply affecting. The king, in one of his brief moments of clarity, seemed to recognize his son and understand what was happening. He reportedly took George's hand and spoke to him with unexpected gentleness, expressing hope that he would rule wisely and well. Then the moment of clarity passed, and the king retreated back into his private world of confusion and delusion. George moved into his new role with a gravity that surprised many observers, who had expected him to treat the Regency as merely an opportunity for greater self-indulgence. He began attending to government business with reasonable diligence, meeting regularly with ministers, and taking a serious interest in the great affairs of state that had previously seemed to bore him. The transition was not seamless. His personal habits remained unchanged, and his attention to duty was often interrupted by his usual pleasures. But he demonstrated a capacity for leadership that many had doubted he possessed. Prince George became regent at one of the most critical moments in European history. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican general who had made himself Emperor of France, had brought most of continental Europe under his direct control or influence. Britain stood almost alone against this seemingly invincible military genius, protected by the English Channel and the Royal Navy, but increasingly isolated and stretched to its limits by the Long War. The Regency period would witness some of the most dramatic military campaigns in British history, culminating in Napoleon's final defeat and the reshaping of the European political order. George, as Prince Regent, found himself playing a significant role in these momentous events, not as a military commander, for his father had never allowed him the military career he craved, but as the symbolic head of the British state and an increasingly active participant in diplomatic affairs. The British strategy against Napoleon rested on two pillars: maintaining naval supremacy to protect the home islands and supporting continental allies who could tie down French armies in exhausting campaigns. The Royal Navy's victory at Trafalgar in 1805 had secured British control of the seas, but Napoleon's subsequent victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland had given him mastery of the European continent. By 1811, only the ongoing war in Spain, where Wellington commanded British forces alongside Spanish and Portuguese allies, offered hope of eventually breaking Napoleon's grip on Europe. George took a keen interest in the Peninsular Campaign, following Wellington's progress with the attention of a man who had always wished to be a soldier himself. He studied maps, discussed strategy with military advisors, and took genuine pride in British victories at battles like Salamanca and Vittoria. Wellington, that austere and uncompromising general, was initially skeptical of the regent's military enthusiasm, but came to appreciate George's consistent support and his willingness to defend the campaign against critics who called for resources to be deployed elsewhere. The Prince Regent's role in these military affairs was primarily ceremonial and diplomatic, rather than strategic. He entertained foreign dignitaries who came to London seeking British support, presided over celebrations of military victories, and used his considerable charm to smooth over diplomatic difficulties that might have complicated military cooperation. His ability to speak multiple languages fluently and his genuine knowledge of European culture made him an effective representative of British interests in these delicate negotiations. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815, which followed Napoleon's initial defeat and exile to Elba, saw George playing a more active role in diplomatic affairs than any British Prince of Wales had attempted in living memory. Though he could not attend in person, the restrictions of the Regency Act and concerns about his presence being misinterpreted prevented direct participation. He maintained regular correspondence with British diplomats and made his views known on key issues. George's diplomatic instincts were generally sound, even if his personal vanity sometimes complicated matters. He understood the importance of creating a stable balance of power in Europe that would prevent any single nation from achieving the kind of dominance Napoleon had wielded. He supported the restoration of legitimate monarchies, not merely out of dynastic solidarity, but from a genuine belief that hereditary rule provided stability that revolutionary governments could never match. The regent's most valuable contribution to the diplomatic process was his ability to entertain visiting dignitaries with a magnificence that impressed even the most jaded European aristocrats. When Tsar Alexander I of Russia visited London in 1814, George hosted entertainments at Carlton House that demonstrated British power and refinement in equal measure. The Tsar, accustomed to the splendors of St. Petersburg, was genuinely impressed by the taste and elegance of the regent's arrangements. Napoleon's escape from Elba in March 1815 and his dramatic return to power, the 100 Days as it came to be known, created panic throughout Europe. The carefully constructed peace settlement seemed on the verge of collapse as Napoleon raised new armies and prepared to reconquer his empire. George, receiving news of these developments, demonstrated a calm resolve that steadied public opinion and supported Wellington's rapid deployment to Belgium to face the French threat. The Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, was the decisive engagement that ended Napoleon's career and secured Britain's position as the dominant European power. When news of Wellington's victory reached London, the celebrations were unprecedented. George hosted a grand fête at Carlton House, where the hero of Waterloo was toasted by the cream of London society, and the Prince Regent personally thanked the general for his service to the nation. George's behaviour in the aftermath of Waterloo revealed both his better qualities and his persistent flaws. He genuinely honoured Wellington's achievement and ensured that the general received appropriate recognition and rewards. But he also developed an unfortunate habit of suggesting that he had personally contributed to the victory, making vague references to strategic insights he had supposedly provided. Wellington, with his characteristic bluntness, later dismissed these claims with barely concealed contempt. The post-Waterloo settlement established a new European order based on the principle of legitimacy and balance of power. The Congress of Vienna's final agreements restored many of the monarchies Napoleon had overthrown. redrew borders throughout Europe, and created mechanisms for managing disputes between nations. Britain emerged from these negotiations as the undisputed naval and colonial power, with strategic possessions throughout the world and a diplomatic influence that would shape European affairs for decades to come. George's role in achieving this outcome was significant, if not decisive. His support for the war effort had been consistent. His willingness to work with ministers he personally disliked had been commendable, and his understanding of European politics had generally been sound. The criticisms that had dogged his early years, that he was too frivolous for serious responsibility, too self-indulgent to think of national interests, seemed at least partially answered by his performance during these critical years. While military victories and diplomatic triumphs dominated the headlines, the Regency period witnessed a cultural flowering that would have lasting impact on British taste and sensibility. George, whatever his personal failings, was a genuine patron of the arts, whose influence extended far beyond the mere spending of money on beautiful objects. He possessed a sophisticated understanding of artistic quality and used his position to promote artists, architects, and craftsmen whose work would define an entire era. The partnership with John Nash that had produced the Brighton Pavilion extended to an even more ambitious project, the complete redesign of central London. Nash proposed creating a grand processional route that would connect Carlton House with the Crown lands of Regent's Park, providing both a magnificent setting for royal ceremonies and an opportunity to develop the surrounding areas in a coherent architectural style. The result was Regent Street, perhaps the most significant example of urban planning to emerge from Georgian England. Nash designed a sweeping curve of elegant buildings, their Portland stone facades creating a unified architectural composition that managed to be both grand and graceful. The street incorporated shops, residences, and places of public entertainment, bringing together commercial activity and fashionable society in a way that was revolutionary for its time. Regent's Park itself was transformed from rough Crown lands into an idealized landscape where nature and architecture existed in carefully planned harmony. Nash designed a series of terraces, grand residential buildings that faced onto the park, each one a masterpiece of classical architecture adapted to English tastes and needs. The park's layout incorporated winding paths, carefully placed plantings, and artificial lakes that created picturesque views from every vantage point. George's support for these projects went beyond merely approving plans and providing funding. He took an active interest in design details, discussed architectural principles with Nash, and insisted on the highest quality materials and craftsmanship. When cost overruns threatened to derail the projects, he used his influence to secure additional funds from Parliament, arguing that these developments would bring lasting benefit to London and establish Britain's capital as one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. The Regent's patronage extended to the fine arts with equal enthusiasm. He was an avid collector of paintings, adding masterpieces by Rubens, Rembrandt, Vermeer, and other old masters to the royal collection. His taste was generally excellent, though his tendency to negotiate aggressively over prices sometimes embarrassed his agents. He understood that the royal collection was not merely personal property, but a national treasure that should be expanded and preserved for future generations. George's interest in contemporary British art was particularly significant. He commissioned portraits from Sir Thomas Lawrence, who captured the regent in images that emphasized his refined tastes while diplomatically minimizing his increasing corpulence. He supported the Royal Academy and attended exhibitions where he would purchase works by promising young artists, providing both financial support and the prestige of royal patronage. The establishment of the National Gallery in 1824 represented perhaps George's most important contribution to British cultural life. He had long believed that London needed a national collection of art that would be accessible to all citizens, not merely those wealthy enough to travel to private galleries or continental museums. When the opportunity arose to purchase the collection of John Julius Angerstein, 38 paintings including works by Raphael, Rembrandt, and other masters, George used his influence to ensure that Parliament provided the necessary funds. The decorative arts flourished under George's patronage. He supported craftsmen working in every medium: furniture makers, silversmiths, porcelain manufacturers, and jewelers. The distinctive Regency style that emerged during this period reflected the prince's personal taste. Classical forms enlivened with Egyptian, Chinese, and other exotic motifs, executed with superb craftsmanship in the finest materials available. Fashion, too, felt the influence of George's taste. In his youth, he had been acknowledged as the best-dressed man in England, setting styles that were copied throughout fashionable society. His friendship with Beau Brummel, the arbiter of masculine elegance, had promoted a style of dress that emphasized perfect fit, subtle colors, and impeccable grooming over the elaborate costumes of earlier periods. Though George's increasing weight eventually made him a figure of ridicule rather than admiration, the standards he had established continued to influence men's fashion long after he could no longer embody them himself. Music and theatre also benefited from the regent's support. He was an accomplished amateur musician who played the cello with genuine skill and maintained his own orchestra at Brighton. He attended the opera regularly, supported new productions, and used his influence to bring celebrated foreign performers to London. The Theatre Royal Drury Lane received his particular attention after a devastating fire, and he personally contributed to its rebuilding. The literary world during the Regency produced some of the greatest works in the English language: Jane Austen's novels, Byron's poetry, Walter Scott's historical romances. Though George's relationship with these writers was complex, he admired Scott's work and eventually made him a baronet. But his attempts to patronize Byron were rebuffed by the poet's Republican sympathies. Jane Austen dedicated Emma to the Prince Regent, though whether she did so willingly or under subtle pressure remains a matter of scholarly debate. This cultural flowering created what we now recognize as the Regency aesthetic, an approach to art, architecture, and design that valued elegance, proportion, and refined ornament over either austere simplicity or excessive decoration. The style reflected George's personality in its contradictions. It was at once classical and exotic, restrained and luxurious, traditional and innovative. At its best, Regency design achieved a perfect balance between these opposing qualities, creating objects and spaces that were both beautiful and functional. Critics then and later would argue that this emphasis on beauty and refinement was a form of escapism, a deliberate turning away from the serious social and economic problems that plagued Britain during this period. The Regency years saw tremendous poverty in industrial cities, harsh repression of political dissent, and growing demands for parliamentary reform. While George commissioned palaces and collected paintings, working people struggled to feed their families, and political reformers faced imprisonment for demanding basic rights. Yet the cultural achievements of the Regency period had their own importance. The buildings Nash designed still grace London's streets. The paintings George collected still inspire visitors to national galleries, and the standards of taste established during this era continue to influence British design. Whatever his personal failings, George's patronage of the arts represented a genuine contribution to British cultural life, one that perhaps deserves recognition alongside the criticisms of his extravagance and self-indulgence. The long-anticipated moment arrived on a cold January morning in 1820, when messengers brought word to Carlton House that King George III had died at Windsor Castle. The old king had passed away peacefully in his sleep, his final years spent in the comfortable obscurity of madness, unaware of the great events that had transformed Europe or the personal scandals that had plagued his family. He was 81 years old and had reigned for nearly 60 years, making him one of the longest-serving monarchs in British history. For Prince George, now King George IV at the age of 57, his father's death brought a mixture of relief and unexpected sadness. The two men had never achieved any real understanding or affection, their relationship poisoned by decades of mutual disappointment and disapproval. Yet, in the moment of the old king's passing, George reportedly wept, perhaps mourning not the father he had known, but the relationship they might have had under different circumstances. The transition of power was smooth from a constitutional perspective. George had been exercising royal authority for nearly a decade as regent, and his formal accession to the throne changed little in practical terms. But the symbolic importance of becoming king, rather than merely regent, was profound. He was now the sovereign in his own right, no longer governing in his father's name, and this new status brought both opportunities and complications. The most immediate complication was the question of Queen Caroline. During George III's lifetime, Caroline had been merely the estranged wife of the Prince Regent, a problematic figure certainly, but one whose status was ambiguous enough that it could be managed through careful diplomacy and generous financial settlements. But with George's accession, Caroline was automatically Queen of the United Kingdom, unless something could be done to prevent her from claiming that title. Caroline, residing in Italy and receiving regular reports about developments in England, understood immediately what her husband's accession meant. She was no longer merely Princess of Wales, but Queen Caroline, with all the rights, privileges, and public recognition that title entailed. The prospect of finally achieving the status she believed she deserved, after years of exile and humiliation, must have filled her with satisfaction and determination. George's reaction to his new situation was one of horror and determination. The idea of Caroline being crowned queen, of standing beside him at state occasions, of being presented to foreign dignitaries as his consort, was absolutely intolerable. He immediately instructed his ministers to find some way, any way, to prevent her from assuming her rightful position. The government, already weary of the royal marital problems that had consumed so much parliamentary time and energy, reluctantly began exploring options. The evidence gathered by the Milan Commission offered one possibility. If Caroline could be proven to have committed adultery with Bartolomeo Pergami, grounds might exist for divorce under English law. But the evidence, while suggestive and even scandalous, was almost entirely circumstantial. No witness could testify to actual adultery, only to behaviour that strongly implied it. Whether this would be sufficient to convince Parliament remained uncertain. George attempted a different approach first, hoping to resolve the matter through negotiation rather than confrontation. He offered Caroline a substantial increase in her income, $50,000 per year, an enormous sum, if she would agree to remain abroad and renounce her claim to be queen. The offer was tactlessly phrased, more like a bribe than a settlement, and included conditions about her behaviour and movements that Caroline found deeply insulting. Caroline's response was defiant. She announced her intention to return to England and claim her rightful position as queen. She would not be bought off with money, nor would she accept any arrangement that required her to remain in exile, while her husband enjoyed all the privileges of monarchy. If George wanted to be rid of her, he would have to face her publicly and prove his accusations in a forum where she could defend herself. The news of Caroline's intended return sent shockwaves through the government. Ministers who had hoped the matter could be quietly resolved through financial arrangements now faced the prospect of a public confrontation that threatened to become a constitutional crisis. The king was adamant that he would not allow Caroline to be crowned, while Caroline was equally determined to claim her rights. The stage was set for a collision that would scandalize Europe and damage the monarchy's reputation for generations. Caroline began her journey to England in the spring of 1820. Travelling slowly through Europe and receiving enthusiastic welcomes in various cities along her route, common people who knew little of the specific accusations against her, but much about her husband's reputation for debauchery, saw her as a wronged woman standing up to a cruel and dissolute king. By the time she reached the Channel coast, Caroline had become a folk hero, a symbol of resistance against royal tyranny and masculine oppression. On June 5, 1820, Caroline landed at Dover and received a tumultuous welcome from the crowds that had gathered to greet her. She proceeded to London in a coach provided by supporters, with cheering crowds lining the roads and people hanging from windows to catch a glimpse of their champion. By the time she reached the capital, it was clear that public opinion had decisively turned in her favour, regardless of whatever truth might lie behind the accusations against her. George, receiving reports of Caroline's triumphal progress, was beside himself with rage and frustration. He had expected her to accept his financial offer and remain abroad, or at worst to return quietly and accept some sort of compromise. Instead, she had transformed her return into a public spectacle and positioned herself as the victim of royal persecution. The situation had spiraled completely beyond his control. The government, under tremendous pressure from the king to resolve the Caroline situation, reluctantly concluded that the only option was to bring formal charges against the Queen in Parliament. The Pains and Penalties Bill, introduced in the House of Lords on July 5, 1820, was unprecedented in British constitutional history, a legislative attempt to dissolve a royal marriage and strip a queen of her title based on allegations of adultery. The bill's title revealed its nature: a bill to deprive Her Majesty Caroline Amelia Elizabeth of the title, prerogatives, rights, privileges and pretensions of Queen Consort of this realm, and to dissolve the marriage between His Majesty and the said Caroline Amelia Elizabeth. The proceedings would effectively put the Queen on trial, with the House of Lords serving as both jury and judge, and the government presenting evidence gathered by the Milan Commission. The political implications were staggering. The Tory government, led by Lord Liverpool, had to prosecute a case against a queen who had become a popular heroine, using evidence gathered by spies and informers whose methods were widely seen as dishonourable. The Whig opposition, which included many of George's old friends, found themselves in the position of defending a woman whose behaviour they privately deplored, simply because attacking her seemed to serve the interests of a king they despised. The proceedings began on August 17, 1820, in a House of Lords packed with peers, spectators and journalists, eager to report every detail to a fascinated public. Caroline herself attended, dressed in mourning clothes that suggested she was the victim rather than the accused, and accompanied by her legal team, led by Henry Brougham, one of the most brilliant and theatrical advocates of the age. The government's case was presented through a series of witnesses, most of them servants or employees, who had observed Caroline's behaviour during her continental travels. Their testimony painted a damning picture of impropriety and indiscretion. They described how Caroline and Pergamy had travelled together unchaperoned, shared accommodations in ways that suggested intimacy, and behaved toward each other with a familiarity that went far beyond what was appropriate between employer and servant. One witness, Theodore Majocchi, became infamous for his repeated response to difficult questions. Non mi ricordo, I don't remember. His convenient lapses of memory on points that might have helped Caroline's case, contrasted with his detailed recollections of compromising situations made him a figure of ridicule in the press. Political caricaturists had a field day with Majocchi, depicting him as either a fool or a liar, and his testimony may have done more harm than good to the government's case. Other witnesses described Caroline bathing on deck during sea voyages while Pergami attended her, the two dining alone together with inappropriate familiarity and sleeping arrangements that strongly suggested a sexual relationship. The testimony was often embarrassingly specific about matters that were normally kept strictly private, and the detailed discussion of bedroom arrangements and intimate behavior scandalized even a society accustomed to gossip about royal indiscretions. Henry Brougham's defense of Caroline was masterful. He attacked the credibility of witnesses, pointing out inconsistencies in their testimony and suggesting they had been bribed or coerced into making false accusations. He emphasized the dishonorable methods used to gather evidence, arguing that sending spies to follow a queen and interrogate her servants violated every principle of British justice. Most effectively, he subtly reminded the Lords that if Caroline's behavior constituted grounds for divorce, what of the king's own conduct? This last point was particularly powerful because it touched on the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of the case. Everyone knew that George had been flagrantly unfaithful to Caroline throughout their marriage. His relationship with Maria Fitzherbert was common knowledge, as were his numerous other affairs and liaisons. If Caroline's alleged adultery with Pergami disqualified her from being queen, how could George's proven infidelities be overlooked? Brougham was careful not to state this argument too explicitly. Directly accusing the king would have been dangerous and potentially counterproductive, but he managed to plant the idea in people's minds through careful questioning and strategic omissions. The press, less constrained than the advocate himself, made the point more bluntly in editorials and satirical prints that compared the king's well-documented debauchery with the Queen's merely alleged indiscretions. The trial dragged on for weeks, with each day bringing new revelations, new witness testimony, and new arguments from both sides. Outside the House of Lords, public opinion remained firmly on Caroline's side. Crowds gathered daily to cheer her arrival and departure, while the king was hissed and booed on the rare occasions when he appeared in public. The trial had become a referendum not merely on Caroline's behavior, but on the monarchy itself. After 52 days of testimony, arguments, and deliberation, the House of Lords finally voted on the Pains and Penalties Bill on November 10, 1820. The result was a narrow victory for the government. 123 peers voted for the bill, while 95 voted against. But this slim majority, achieved only after intense pressure from government whips and the threat of the king's displeasure, was clearly insufficient to pass the bill through the House of Commons, where Caroline's popularity was even stronger. Lord Liverpool, recognizing that pursuing the matter further would only deepen the crisis and potentially bring down the government, advised the king that the bill would have to be withdrawn. George, who had followed every detail of the trial with obsessive attention, was furious. He had expected a decisive verdict that would rid him of Caroline forever, not this humiliating failure that left the situation unresolved and his wife's position stronger than ever. The withdrawal of the bill was celebrated as a great victory for Caroline and her supporters. Crowds filled the streets of London, cheering, firing guns into the air, and illuminating their windows in celebration. The Queen herself appeared at her residence, acknowledging the cheers of the crowd with a dignity that contrasted sharply with the undignified spectacle of the trial. For a moment, it seemed that Caroline had won not merely a legal victory, but a moral triumph that vindicated her against years of persecution. But George was determined that Caroline would not share in his coronation. The ceremony was scheduled for July 19, 1821, nearly a year after the trial's conclusion, and preparations proceeded with a magnificence designed to demonstrate that the king remained in control despite his humiliation over the failed bill. George commissioned elaborate robes and regalia, planned ceremonies that would rival any coronation in European history, and made it absolutely clear that Caroline would not be welcome at Westminster Abbey. The coronation preparations consumed George's attention and vast sums of money. He designed his own coronation robes, featuring trains of crimson velvet 30 feet long, elaborate embroidery in gold thread, and ermine trimming that required the pelts of thousands of animals. His crown was specially created for the occasion, featuring over 12,000 diamonds and other precious stones, weighing several pounds and costing a fortune. The total expenditure on the coronation was estimated at over $240,000, making it perhaps the most expensive such ceremony in British history. Caroline, watching these preparations with growing alarm, realized that George intended to exclude her entirely from the ceremony. She consulted with her advisors and supporters, who were divided on how to respond. Some urged her to accept the situation gracefully and content herself with the moral victory she had achieved in the trial. Others, more combative, insisted she should assert her rights as queen and demand to be crowned alongside her husband. Caroline chose confrontation. She announced her intention to attend the coronation and take her rightful place in the ceremony. The government responded by refusing to issue her a ticket of admission and instructing officials at Westminster Abbey that she was not to be admitted under any circumstances. The stage was set for yet another public spectacle, this one even more dramatic than the trial because it would play out in the full view of the crowds gathered to watch the coronation. On the morning of July 19, 1821, Caroline appeared at Westminster Abbey, dressed in royal robes and demanding admission. She approached the west door of the abbey, but found it locked and guarded by doorkeepers who had been given strict instructions. She argued with them, insisting on her right to enter as queen, but they refused to yield. The watching crowd, many of whom had cheered Caroline during the trial, now witnessed her humiliation in uncomfortable silence. Caroline tried other entrances, moving around the abbey in search of a door that might be open to her. At each entrance, she encountered locked doors and implacable officials who turned her away. The contrast between her determined but ultimately futile attempts to enter and the magnificent ceremony proceeding inside the abbey was both poignant and pathetic. After nearly an hour of this public rejection, Caroline finally gave up and returned to her residence, defeated and humiliated. Inside the abbey, George's coronation proceeded with unprecedented splendor. The ceremony lasted nearly 6 hours, featuring elaborate rituals that had been enhanced and embellished to create maximum dramatic effect. George himself was the center of attention, playing his role with theatrical flair, despite the physical difficulties created by his weight and the oppressive heat generated by thousands of candles and the press of bodies in the crowded abbey. The banquet that followed the coronation in Westminster Hall was equally magnificent. Over 2,000 guests were served a meal featuring hundreds of elaborate dishes, exotic delicacies, and the finest wines from the royal cellars. George presided over the feast wearing his coronation robes, accepting the homage of peers and dignitaries, and apparently unconcerned about the scandal unfolding beyond the abbey walls. But the coronation's magnificence could not erase the ugliness of Caroline's exclusion. The newspapers, while dutifully describing the ceremony's splendor, also reported Caroline's humiliating rejection at the abbey doors. Political commentators noted the uncomfortable contrast between the king's extravagant celebration and his treatment of his wife. Even some of George's supporters privately expressed discomfort at the spectacle of a queen being turned away from her husband's coronation. The final chapter of this sad story came just 3 weeks later. Caroline, who had appeared to be in reasonable health during the coronation, suddenly fell ill with what her doctors diagnosed as an intestinal obstruction. She suffered intense pain, and despite the best efforts of her physicians, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She died on August 7, 1821, aged 53, finally released from a marriage that had brought her nothing but misery. Caroline's death sparked immediate speculation about its cause. Some suggested she had been poisoned by agents working for the king, though no evidence supported this theory. Others believed she had died of a broken heart, the final humiliation of the coronation having destroyed her will to live. Most likely, she died of natural causes, possibly cancer or another serious illness. But the timing so soon after the coronation made conspiracy theories inevitable. Caroline's funeral became one final occasion for public demonstration. She had requested in her will that she be buried in Brunswick, her homeland, with a coffin plate reading, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England." George's government initially tried to prevent this inscription from being used, but public outrage forced them to back down. The funeral procession through London drew enormous crowds, and when authorities attempted to divert the route to avoid certain neighbourhoods, riots broke out that required military intervention to suppress. With Caroline dead and his coronation complete, King George IV might have hoped for a quieter period in his reign. Instead, he found himself confronting a political crisis that would force him to act against his deepest convictions and approve a measure he had opposed throughout his adult life: the question of Catholic emancipation, whether to remove the legal disabilities that prevented Catholics from sitting in Parliament and holding high office, had been simmering for decades, and by 1828 it had reached a boiling point. The issue was particularly acute in Ireland, where the vast majority of the Yuchi population was Catholic, but political and economic power remained firmly in the hands of the Protestant ascendancy. Daniel O'Connell, a brilliant lawyer and charismatic leader known as the Liberator, had built a mass movement demanding full civil rights for Catholics. His Catholic Association mobilized hundreds of thousands of supporters, collected funds through a Catholic rent of a penny per month, and organized political campaigns that demonstrated the power of popular mobilization. George had always been firmly opposed to Catholic emancipation, despite his own secret marriage to the Catholic Maria Fitzherbert. His opposition was both personal and political. He genuinely believed in the Protestant nature of the British Constitution, and he remembered all too well how his relationship with Maria had been used against him politically. The idea that Catholics might sit in Parliament and influence policy filled him with alarm, bringing back memories of the Jacobite threats of earlier generations. The crisis came to a head in 1828, when O'Connell stood for election to Parliament in County Clare. As a Catholic, O'Connell was legally permitted to be elected but forbidden from taking his seat because he could not swear the required oath acknowledging the monarch as supreme governor of the Church and renouncing Catholic doctrine. His campaign was a direct challenge to this system, a demonstration that the will of the Irish Catholic majority could no longer be ignored through legal technicalities. O'Connell's victory was overwhelming. He defeated his opponent, a government minister, by 2,057 votes to 982, in an election that saw unprecedented turnout and organisation among Catholic voters. The result sent shockwaves through the British political establishment. If O'Connell could not take his seat, another election would have to be called, which he would almost certainly win again. The situation threatened to spiral into a constitutional crisis that could tear Ireland apart. The Duke of Wellington, now Prime Minister, and Sir Robert Peel, his Home Secretary, recognised that they faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to enforce the existing laws against Catholic participation in Parliament, which would likely provoke rebellion in Ireland and require massive military intervention to suppress. Or they could accept the need for Catholic emancipation, breaking with decades of Tory policy and betraying the principles that had defined their political careers, Wellington, that stern and uncompromising military hero, surprised many by concluding that emancipation was necessary. He famously declared that, though emancipation was a great danger, civil strife was a greater danger. Peel, who had been nicknamed Orange Peel for his fierce anti-Catholic views, came to the same reluctant conclusion. Together, they drafted the Roman Catholic Relief Act and prepared to guide it through Parliament, knowing that their own party would see this as betrayal. But there was one more obstacle to overcome: the king himself. George IV would have to give royal assent to any Catholic emancipation bill, and he had spent decades making clear his absolute opposition to such a measure. Wellington and Peel knew that convincing the king would be the most difficult challenge they faced, potentially more difficult than passing the bill through Parliament. The Prime Minister requested an audience with the king at Windsor Castle in early 1829. The meeting was stormy, with George initially refusing even to consider the proposal. He spoke passionately about his coronation oath, which he believed required him to maintain the Protestant nature of the Constitution. He brought up his father's similar objections, suggesting that the mental illness that had afflicted George III might have been divine punishment for even considering Catholic relief. Wellington responded with arguments both practical and dramatic. He painted a picture of Ireland in flames, of British troops unable to maintain order against an aroused population, of the possible dissolution of the United Kingdom itself. He pointed out that even the Pope had indicated willingness to accept certain concessions regarding the appointment of Catholic bishops, removing some Protestant concerns about foreign interference in British affairs. Most effectively, perhaps, he threatened to resign if the king refused to approve the measure. The threat of Wellington's resignation was particularly powerful because it implied that a Whig government might follow, bringing to power George's old political opponents, who would almost certainly pursue even more radical reforms. The king, faced with the choice between accepting Catholic emancipation from a Tory government he trusted or seeing his political enemies take power, found himself trapped by his own political manoeuvring of decades past. The negotiations continued over several weeks, with George alternating between grudging acceptance and furious resistance. He demanded modifications to the bill, insisted on provisions that would limit Catholic power, and extracted promises about other political matters as the price of his consent. Wellington and Peel acceded to these demands where they could, knowing that the principle of emancipation mattered more than the specific details. On April 13, 1829, King George IV finally gave his royal assent to the Roman Catholic Relief Act. The ceremony was brief and joyless, with George apparently regarding the whole affair as a personal defeat and a betrayal of everything he believed in. He reportedly complained to courtiers that he had been bullied into accepting the measure, that his ministers had taken advantage of his weakened health and isolation, and that history would judge him harshly for abandoning the Protestant cause. The act removed most of the remaining legal disabilities affecting Catholics. They could now sit in Parliament after taking a modified oath that did not require them to renounce Catholic doctrine. They could hold most public offices and could attend universities without restriction. The penal laws that had oppressed Catholics for over a century were finally being dismantled, though full equality would take decades more to achieve. O'Connell himself was permitted to stand for election again in County Clare, and this time take his seat in Parliament, where he became a powerful voice for Irish interests and reform. His victory was celebrated throughout Catholic Ireland as a triumph of peaceful political organisation over oppression. But the cost was high. The same act that granted emancipation also raised the property qualification for voting in Ireland, effectively disenfranchising the very tenant farmers who had voted for O'Connell and made his victory possible. For George, the passage of Catholic emancipation represented a profound personal defeat. He had been forced to approve a measure he detested, betraying what he saw as the fundamental principles of the British Constitution. The fact that he had done so not out of conviction, but out of political necessity, made the defeat even more bitter. His resentment toward Wellington and Peel never entirely faded, and their relationship remained strained for the rest of his reign. The final years of George III's life were marked by a physical and mental deterioration that was painful to witness, and which became the subject of cruel mockery in the press and popular culture. The handsome young prince who had been celebrated as the first gentleman of England had transformed into a grotesquely obese, pain-ridden old man who spent most of his time in seclusion, seeing only a handful of trusted servants and companions. George's weight had been a concern since his 30s, but in his final decade it reached truly alarming proportions. By the late 1820s, his waist measured 50 inches, requiring corsets specially designed to provide support while allowing him to breathe and move. His weight was estimated at over 20 stone, 280 pounds, an enormous burden on a frame that was only 5 feet 9 inches tall. The extra weight put tremendous strain on his joints, contributing to the gout that caused him agonizing pain with increasing frequency. The physical manifestations of his decline were impossible to hide. His legs swelled with fluid retention, what Georgian doctors called dropsy, and we would recognize as edema caused by heart failure. His breathing became labored, with frequent episodes where he would gasp for air, terrifying his attendants who feared each attack might be his last. He suffered from what were probably gallstones, causing attacks of abdominal pain so severe that he would sometimes faint from the agony. George's doctors prescribed laudanum, a tincture of opium, for his various ailments, and the king became increasingly dependent on the drug. The laudanum provided relief from pain, but also clouded his judgment and contributed to mood swings that made him difficult to deal with. There were days when he would be lucid and engaged, discussing politics or art with real intelligence, but there were also days when he seemed barely present, speaking in confused circles or lapsing into tearful reminiscences about his past. The king's mental state was complicated by what appears to have been clinical depression. He spent hours dwelling on past grievances and disappointments, his failed marriage to Caroline, his troubled relationship with his father, the loss of his daughter Charlotte, who had died in childbirth back in 1817. He would speak obsessively about Maria Fitzherbert, the woman he considered his true wife, expressing regret that circumstances had forced them apart and wondering what his life might have been if he had been able to remain with her. The isolation of these final years was largely self-imposed. George had always been sociable, thriving in the company of witty friends and admiring courtiers. But as his health deteriorated and his appearance became increasingly grotesque, he withdrew from public life almost completely. He spent most of his time at Windsor Castle, venturing out only for brief trips to his beloved Brighton pavilion, and seeing visitors only when absolutely necessary for state business. The king's daily routine in these final years was both pathetic and revealing. He would rise late, often not emerging from his bedchamber until midday, having spent the morning being dressed and groomed by his attendants, a process that took hours due to his size and immobility. His meals were still elaborate affairs, with French chefs preparing rich dishes that his doctors advised against, but which he insisted upon eating. The quantities he consumed remained enormous, despite the obvious toll that overeating was taking on his health. After meals, George would often spend hours in his private apartments, surrounded by the beautiful objects he had collected over a lifetime: paintings, porcelain, sculptures, and exquisite furniture. He would sometimes ask attendants to bring out particular pieces so he could examine them, reminiscing about where he had acquired them and why he had found them so appealing. These sessions revealed a genuine aesthetic sensibility that persisted even as his physical and mental powers declined. The king's relationship with his physicians during this period was complex and often contentious. Sir William Knighton, who served as both his doctor and keeper of the privy purse, wielded enormous influence over the isolated monarch. Knighton controlled access to the king, managed his finances, and essentially determined what information reached him and what was kept from him. This power was resented by ministers and courtiers, but George seemed dependent on Knighton's care and unwilling to dismiss him despite persistent criticism. George's sleep was troubled by nightmares and anxiety, requiring ever-increasing doses of laudanum to achieve even a few hours of rest. He would sometimes wake in the middle of the night in a state of panic, convinced that assassins were lurking in the corridors or that political enemies were plotting his overthrow. His attendants would have to reassure him, sometimes sitting with him for hours until he calmed down enough to sleep again. The satirists and caricaturists who had mocked George throughout his life became even more cruel as his decline became obvious. Prints appeared showing him as a grotesque figure, barely human in his obesity and excess. The nursery rhyme, Georgie, Porgy, Pudding and Pie, took on new resonance as it was applied to an aging king whose gluttony had literally transformed his body into something monstrous. The cruelty of these attacks was breathtaking, showing no mercy for a man who was clearly suffering. Yet, even in decline, flashes of George's better qualities occasionally appeared. He still took interest in the arts, continuing to make acquisitions for the royal collection and supporting artists whose work he admired. He followed political developments with genuine concern, even if he could no longer influence them as actively as in his younger years, and he maintained his personal charm when meeting with the few visitors he would still receive, showing that beneath the physical deterioration, something of the original personality remained. The king's relationship with his younger brother William, Duke of Clarence, became increasingly important during this period. William, who would succeed George as William IV, was a bluff, straightforward character who lacked his brother's sophistication but possessed genuine warmth and loyalty. He visited George regularly, bringing news of the outside world and providing companionship that the isolated king desperately needed. George, who had always been somewhat dismissive of William's simpler tastes and more conventional lifestyle, came to appreciate his brother's steadfast presence. One particularly poignant aspect of George's final years was his continued devotion to Maria Fitzherbert. Though they had been separated for many years, the king kept her portrait in his private rooms and wore a miniature of her on a chain around his neck. He would sometimes write her letters, though whether these were ever sent is uncertain. His attendants reported that he would speak of her with tears in his eyes, calling her the wife of my heart, and expressing regret that duty and circumstance had kept them apart. Despite the personal deterioration that marked his final years, George IV's contributions to British art and architecture continued to accumulate and take their place in the nation's cultural heritage. The buildings he commissioned, the collections he assembled, and the institutions he supported would outlive him by centuries, providing a more positive legacy than the scandals and excess that dominated contemporary opinion. The transformation of Windsor Castle represented one of George's most ambitious and successful architectural projects. Working with the architect Geoffrey Wyatville, he completely redesigned the medieval fortress, adding the distinctive round tower that still dominates the skyline and creating sumptuous state apartments that combined historical authenticity with modern comfort. The project cost over $1 million, an enormous sum that provoked the usual complaints about royal extravagance. but the result was a palace worthy of Britain's status as a great power. Buckingham Palace, which George inherited as Buckingham House and set out to transform into a proper royal residence, benefited from John Nash's genius but was less successful in execution. The project ran massively over budget. Cost overruns eventually led to Nash's dismissal before completion, and George himself never lived to see it finished. But the basic design was sound, and later monarchs would complete the work George had begun, creating the iconic building that now serves as the primary royal residence in London. George's art collecting reached its peak during the 1820s, when he acquired some of the finest works ever to enter the royal collection. His agents scoured Europe for masterpieces, taking advantage of political upheavals that had forced aristocratic families to sell their treasures. Among his acquisitions were paintings by Rembrandt, Rubens, Van Dyck, and Canaletto, works that would be treasured by future generations and eventually displayed in national galleries for all citizens to enjoy. The king's taste in art was generally excellent, though sometimes controversial. He particularly loved Dutch and Flemish masters, appreciating their technical virtuosity and attention to detail. He also collected contemporary British art, supporting artists like Thomas Lawrence, whose portraits captured the elegance and refinement of Regency society, and George Stubbs, whose paintings of horses reflected the king's lifelong passion for the turf. The establishment of the National Gallery in 1824 represented perhaps George's most enduring contribution to British cultural life. The gallery was founded with the acquisition of 38 paintings from the collection of John Julius Angerstein, purchased with funds that George helped secure from a reluctant Parliament. The king understood that Britain needed a national collection accessible to all citizens, not merely those wealthy enough to view private galleries, and he used his influence to make this vision reality. George's support for decorative arts had equally lasting impact. The craftsmen he patronized, furniture makers like Thomas Chippendale the Younger, silversmiths like Paul Storr, and porcelain manufacturers like the Worcester and Derby factories, produced works of such quality that they remain highly prized by collectors today. The Regency style they helped create, with its blend of classical forms and exotic ornament, influenced British design for decades and experienced multiple revivals in subsequent centuries. The king's architectural patronage extended beyond his own palaces and into the public realm. He supported the development of Regent's Park and Regent Street, transforming London's urban landscape and establishing new standards for city planning. He encouraged the Gothic revival in architecture, supporting projects like the rebuilding of Westminster Palace after the devastating fire of 1834. Though this occurred after his death, it built on foundations he had laid during his reign. Music and theatre also benefited from royal patronage. George maintained his own musical establishment, supported the Italian Opera in London, and contributed to the rebuilding of theatres that had been destroyed by fire. His genuine love of music, he was an accomplished cellist who played with real skill, meant that his patronage went beyond mere financial support to include genuine understanding and appreciation of the art form. The literary world during George's reign produced masterpieces that defined the Romantic era. The poetry of Byron, Shelley and Keats, the novels of Jane Austen and Walter Scott, the essays and criticism that established new standards for English prose. While George's personal relationship with these writers was sometimes problematic, Byron openly mocked him, while Austen's dedication of Emma to the Prince Regent may have been made reluctantly. There is no question that the cultural atmosphere of the Regency period encouraged literary achievement of the highest order. George's influence on fashion and manners, though less tangible than buildings or paintings, was equally significant. In his youth, he had established standards of masculine elegance that emphasized perfect fit, subtle color, and impeccable grooming over the elaborate costumes of earlier periods. Even after his own appearance deteriorated, these standards persisted, shaping British ideas about proper dress for gentlemen throughout the Victorian era and beyond. The concept of the gentleman itself, that ideal figure who combined birth, education, taste, and character, was shaped significantly by George's example and influence. The gentleman was not merely someone of noble birth, but someone who understood art, appreciated beauty, spoke multiple languages, and moved through society with grace and confidence. While George himself often failed to live up to this ideal in his personal behaviour, the standard he set influenced British culture for generations. Looking at George's cultural legacy from the perspective of the 21st century, it's possible to see achievements that were obscured by the scandals and excess of his lifetime. The buildings he commissioned still grace London's streets and remain functional, beautiful structures. The art he collected still inspires visitors to galleries and museums. The institutions he supported, the National Gallery, the Royal Academy, various charitable and cultural organisations, continued to enrich British life. The winter of 1829-1830 found King George IV retreating ever more completely from public life and royal responsibilities. Windsor Castle became his fortress and his prison, the place where he sought refuge from the world that had disappointed him so profoundly and from his own failing body, that had become a source of constant pain and humiliation. The king's daily routine had contracted to a narrow round of eating, sleeping, and brief intervals of consciousness in which he would sometimes engage with the few people still allowed into his presence. Sir William Knighton, his physician and confidant, controlled access with an iron hand, turning away ministers who needed royal approval for government business and family members who wished to pay their respects. The result was that Britain's king became almost invisible, a ghostly presence in his own realm. George's apartments at Windsor were kept shuttered against the daylight, with heavy curtains drawn to protect his sensitive eyes from the sun. The rooms were overheated to combat his constant feeling of being cold, a symptom of his poor circulation, creating an atmosphere that visitors found oppressive and unhealthy. The air was thick with the smells of medicine, perfume used to mask other odours, and the rich foods that the king continued to consume despite his doctor's increasingly desperate warnings. The king's appearance in these final months was shocking to those who remembered him in his prime. His face was bloated and heavily jowled, with the once handsome features lost in folds of flesh. His legs were so swollen that he could no longer walk more than a few steps without assistance, and he spent most of his time in a specially designed wheeled chair that allowed him to be moved from room to room. The elegant clothes he had once worn with such style now seemed like costumes on a figure that had become almost cartoonish in its proportions. Yet George's mind, though often clouded by laudanum and depression, still had moments of clarity. He would discuss political affairs with surprising acuity, offering opinions on current controversies and demonstrating that he still understood the complexities of governance. He took interest in news from Europe, where revolutions were beginning to break out in 1830, and expressed concern about the stability of monarchies throughout the continent. These moments of engagement suggested that beneath the physical wreckage, the intelligent and cultured prince still existed. The king's isolation was not merely physical, but emotional. Most of his old friends were dead or had drifted away, unable to maintain relationships with someone who had become so difficult and reclusive. His relationship with his remaining siblings was complicated by years of family conflict and jealousy. His daughter Charlotte, whom he had genuinely loved, had died in childbirth years earlier, depriving him of what might have been his most important emotional connection. Maria Fitzherbert, the woman George considered his true wife, remained in Brighton, maintaining a dignified distance from the dying king. She had never remarried after their final separation, living quietly and supporting Catholic charities. Whether she knew how often George spoke of her in his final days, whether she understood that he wore her miniature next to his heart, is uncertain. Their story had been one of passion thwarted by duty, and now it was approaching its final chapter. George's health crises became more frequent and more severe as 1830 progressed. He suffered attacks of breathlessness so intense that he would turn blue from lack of oxygen, requiring his attendants to prop him upright in his chair to help him breathe. His appetite, once so prodigious, began to fail, though he still insisted on rich foods that his body could no longer properly digest. He complained of chest pains, probably angina caused by his severely compromised cardiovascular system. The government continued to function without the king's active participation, with ministers making decisions and simply informing George of what had been done in his name. This situation, while practically necessary, was constitutionally awkward and contributed to a sense that the monarchy itself was in crisis. Reformers used George's incapacity as evidence that the system needed changing, that Britain could not continue to be governed by an institution so dependent on the personal capacity of a single individual. On June 26, 1830, at approximately 3:15 in the morning, King George IV died at Windsor Castle. He was 67 years old and had reigned for just over 10 years, though he had effectively governed as Prince Regent for nearly a decade before that. The immediate cause of death was likely a ruptured blood vessel in his stomach, though his overall health had deteriorated to such an extent that multiple organ failure was essentially inevitable. The king's death was attended by only a handful of people: Sir William Knighton, a few servants, and his younger brother William, Duke of Clarence, who had been summoned when it became clear that the end was near. There were no dramatic final words, no profound statements for posterity. George simply slipped away, his laboured breathing finally ceasing, bringing an end to a life that had been lived with such intensity and passion. When attendants prepared the body for burial, they found that George was wearing the miniature portrait of Maria Fitzherbert on a chain around his neck. Following his previously expressed wishes, this miniature was left in place, and George was buried with it, a final gesture of devotion to the woman he had loved above all others, even if circumstances had prevented him from spending his life with her. The discovery of the miniature, when it became known, added a note of pathos to an otherwise inglorious end. The announcement of the king's death provoked reactions that ranged from dutiful mourning to barely concealed relief to outright celebration. The official pronouncement spoke of the loss of a great monarch, praising his patronage of the arts and his role in defeating Napoleon. But these formal tributes were undercut by public sentiment that was far less charitable about the late king's character and achievements. The Times newspaper, never sympathetic to George during his lifetime, published an obituary that remains one of the most brutal assessments ever written about a British monarch. There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king, the anonymous writer declared. What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow? The obituary catalogued George's failures with merciless precision. His extravagance, his debauchery, his treatment of his wife, his selfishness, his failure to provide moral leadership. Other newspapers were only slightly less harsh. The Morning Chronicle, while acknowledging George's cultural contributions, emphasized his personal failings and suggested that his reign had diminished the monarchy's dignity and authority. Political reformers pointed to his example as evidence that hereditary monarchy was fundamentally flawed, that a system depending on the character of individuals rather than institutions was bound to fail. The funeral arrangements reflected George's complicated legacy. He was buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor with full royal honours. but the ceremony was notably less elaborate than his coronation had been. The government, mindful of public opinion and conscious that George's brother and successor William IV preferred simpler arrangements, scaled back the theatrical elements that George himself would probably have insisted upon. The result was a service that was dignified but not extravagant, appropriate for a king, but not the spectacular production George had once envisioned. The late king's will revealed both his attachment to beautiful objects and his complicated emotional life. He left detailed instructions about the disposition of his art collection, furniture, and personal treasures, demonstrating even in death his concern for aesthetics and proper care of valuable objects. He requested that Maria Fitzherbert be given certain mementos, a gesture that publicly acknowledged their relationship, even if it could not legitimize it. His legitimate heir, his brother William, inherited the throne, but also the massive debts that George had continued to accumulate until his final days. William IV, who succeeded his brother as king, presented a stark contrast to George in almost every respect. Where George had been cultured and refined, William was bluff and straightforward. Where George had loved luxury and display, William preferred simplicity and practicality. Where George had surrounded himself with artists and aesthetes, William felt more comfortable with naval officers and country squires. The new king immediately set about reducing royal expenditure, simplifying court ceremonies, and distancing himself from his brother's extravagant lifestyle. Historical assessment of George IV has always struggled with the contradictions inherent in his character and reign. He was simultaneously a man of genuine cultural achievement and spectacular personal failure, someone who contributed enormously to British artistic life, while damaging the monarchy's moral authority, perhaps irreparably. How should history remember such a figure? On the positive side of the ledger, George's contributions to British culture were substantial and lasting. The buildings he commissioned, Brighton Pavilion, the transformation of Windsor Castle, the development of Regent Street and Regent's Park, remain among Britain's architectural treasures. His art collecting enriched the royal collection with masterpieces that continue to inspire and educate. His patronage supported craftsmen, whose work set standards for quality and taste that influenced subsequent generations. George also presided over a period of enormous cultural flowering. The Regency era produced some of the greatest achievements in English literature, music, and visual arts. While it would be too much to credit George personally with these achievements, his support for the arts created an atmosphere where creativity could flourish. The Regency style in architecture, furniture, fashion, and decorative arts represented a genuine aesthetic achievement, combining classical elegance with exotic influences in ways that were both sophisticated and appealing. During his time as Prince Regent, George provided steady, if not particularly active, leadership through the final phase of the Napoleonic Wars and the difficult transition to peace. He supported Wellington's campaigns, attended to diplomatic responsibilities, and represented Britain effectively in dealings with foreign powers. His approval of Catholic emancipation, though reluctant and politically forced, nevertheless removed a significant source of injustice and helped integrate Catholics more fully into British political life. But these achievements must be weighed against equally significant failures. George's personal extravagance, during periods of economic hardship, created genuine resentment among ordinary people struggling to survive. His treatment of his wife Caroline, whatever her own failings, was cruel and vindictive, turning their marriage into a public spectacle that damaged the monarchy's dignity. His inability to control his appetites for food, drink, gambling, and sexual pleasure set a terrible example and made him a figure of mockery rather than respect. George's relationship with his father, King George III, reflected poorly on both men, but particularly on the son. The prince seemed unable to appreciate his father's genuine concern for the nation's welfare, seeing only restrictions and disapproval where there might have been opportunities for understanding. The bitter animosity between them weakened the monarchy at a critical period and contributed to the public perception that the royal family was dysfunctional and unsuited to leadership. The enormous debts George accumulated throughout his life represented not merely personal extravagance, but a fundamental failure to understand the responsibilities that came with his position. While Georgian aristocrats commonly lived beyond their means, the heir to the throne had obligations beyond those of ordinary nobles. His repeated need for parliamentary bailouts embarrassed the nation and created legitimate questions about whether he was fit to rule. Perhaps most damagingly, George seemed to lack any sense of duty or service beyond what pleased him personally. Unlike his father, who saw kingship as a sacred trust that required personal sacrifice, George appeared to view the monarchy primarily as an opportunity for indulgence. He pursued his own pleasures with single-minded determination, seemingly unconcerned about public opinion or the example he was setting for his subjects. Yet the paradox of George IV is that his very weaknesses may have contributed to a transformation in the nature of British monarchy. His personal failings demonstrated that the nation could not depend on the monarch's character alone for effective governance. This realization strengthened parliamentary institutions and ministerial responsibility, moving Britain further along the path toward constitutional monarchy. The reforms of the 1830s and beyond, which limited royal power and expanded democratic participation, were partly reactions to the perceived inadequacies of George's reign. George also represented a new kind of royal celebrity, someone whose personal life was endlessly fascinating to the public, even as his political power declined. The intense press coverage of his marriages, relationships, and lifestyle established patterns that would continue with subsequent royals. In this sense, George was a pioneer of the modern celebrity monarchy, where public interest focuses as much on personalities and scandals as on constitutional functions. The architectural and artistic legacy George left behind proved more enduring than anyone might have predicted. Brighton Pavilion, initially mocked as a folly and nearly demolished after his death, is now recognized as an architectural masterpiece and major tourist attraction. The National Gallery he helped establish has become one of the world's great art museums. The urban planning concepts embodied in Regent's Park and Regent Street influenced city development throughout Britain and beyond. Modern historians have generally been somewhat more charitable toward George than his contemporaries were, recognizing his genuine aesthetic sensibility and his contributions to British cultural life. The emphasis has shifted from his personal scandals, which, shocking as they were to Georgian sensibilities, seem relatively mild by modern standards, to a more nuanced assessment of his reign's complexity and contradictions. Some scholars argue that George's very extravagance served a purpose, maintaining the theatrical aspects of monarchy that helped preserve its mystique and appeal during a period when royal political power was declining. The magnificent spectacles he created, coronations, state visits, public ceremonies, demonstrated that monarchy could offer something that elected politicians could not: pageantry, tradition, and connection to national history that transcended mundane political disputes. Others contend that George's failures were more significant than his achievements, that he squandered opportunities to provide leadership during a period of enormous social and economic change. While he commissioned beautiful buildings and collected magnificent art, ordinary people suffered from industrialization's dislocations. Political reformers faced brutal suppression, and the gap between rich and poor widened alarmingly. A king more concerned with his nation's welfare than his own pleasure might have used royal influence to address these problems. The truth, as is often the case with historical figures, lies somewhere between these extremes. George IV was neither the complete villain that the Times obituary suggested, nor the cultured patron that more sympathetic assessments have portrayed. He was a complex, contradictory human being whose strengths and weaknesses were both magnified by his position, and whose reign reflected the tensions and transitions of his era. And so, dear sleepy listener, we come to the end of our journey through the extraordinary life of King George IV, that glamorous, scandalous, contradictory monarch who nearly bankrupted Britain while creating some of its most beautiful treasures, from the rebellious young prince gambling away fortunes in London's clubs, to the secret husband of a forbidden Catholic love, to the regent who guided Britain through Napoleon's defeat, to the king who reluctantly approved Catholic emancipation. George's story has been one of magnificent achievement and spectacular failure, often occurring simultaneously. We've walked through the splendid rooms of Brighton Pavilion, witnessed the drama of Caroline's trial, stood outside Westminster Abbey as a queen was denied her crown, and watched as a once handsome prince transformed into a tragic figure, isolated by his own excess. Through it all, we've seen how one man's pursuit of beauty and pleasure helped shape an entire era of British culture, while his personal scandals demonstrated the growing gap between monarchical pretensions and democratic realities. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of those glittering Regency assemblies, of Oriental palaces rising from English seaside towns, of the magnificent collections that now grace national museums, or of the human drama behind the royal facade. George III's story reminds us that history is made by real people, with real passions, real weaknesses and real achievements. People who are neither heroes nor villains, but complex human beings navigating the circumstances life presents them. Before you fully surrender to sleep, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Even if you're feeling shy, just share which part of George's story resonated with you most. Was it the romantic tragedy of Maria Fitzherbert, the architectural wonder of Brighton Pavilion, or perhaps the dramatic confrontation at his coronation? Your gentle comments help our Sleepy Crown family grow and guide us in creating more of these soothing historical journeys. And if you've enjoyed this peaceful exploration of Georgian history, a quiet like and subscribe would mean the world to us. It helps us continue bringing you these calming tales from history's pages, transforming dramatic events into gentle lullabies that carry you into restful sleep. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Sleepy Crown, where history becomes your companion on the journey to dreamland. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the elegance and beauty that George V, for all his faults, genuinely loved and helped preserve for future generations. Good night and sweet dreams.